motive. So the other thing is it simplifies fares for riders. So the agency could just like market it like you will not pay more than $4 or $5 a day, or maybe more than $100 a month. So the riders, they don't have to do the math and like this month I will be taking this many trips per day, so I should take the I should buy the monthly pass or pay the daily or what. So they will know that like the maximum that they could pay for transit is going to be like this amount. So it makes them more makes things easier for the riders. And the other thing here, like this is also has been emerging. So by September of 2021, there are like at least 21 agencies that among the largest 101 agencies in the United States had fare capping. So as we see here, like we see these two, like the mobile fare payment apps and the fare capping are emerging. So the question is like these policies and apps, they have some benefits that we know, but like, do they affect ridership? And this is what we are seeking to answer here. And so here in this chart, just I'm showing the number of agencies that adopt the app or the cap in the different months. And here I'm showing the app in through the daily cap, which like if the agency has a daily cap or a monthly cap. And here we're focusing on the daily and monthly because these are the most common in the United States. And the important thing to see here from the figure, we see that like the different agencies adopted these policies at different years. So some agencies in 2012, in 2013, and so on. And this is aspect of this disaggregation is important because it will dictate the methods that we will be using in this analysis. So the research questions that we are trying to answer are like, does the launch of mobile fare payment application increase bus ridership, or does the adoption of daily fare capping increase bus ridership? And the same for the monthly. So to answer this question, we use a method, staggered difference in difference method. So this staggered difference in difference method is like an emerging method that is basically an extension of the traditional difference in difference that has been used for many years. So in the traditional difference in difference, we generally have one treatment group, one control group, and all the treated unit receives the treatment at one point of a time. So here in this staggered difference in difference, it allows to have multiple treated unit or groups that receives the treatment at different time points. And this is like fits what we have here because we, as I showed in the graph earlier, different agencies that had different adoption years. So that's why we chose to go with this staggered difference in difference approach. So, and here for the timeline of the study, we'll be studying ridership from 2011 to 2019, which is prior to COVID-19, because like during COVID, every agency experienced dramatic drop in ridership. And we selected the largest 50 plus agencies in the United States, excluding New York, because New York is just different. We are looking at the impact at the agency level. And then the treatment unit that we are defining for each of the research question is either the launch of the mobile app or the adoption of like the daily fare capping or the monthly fare capping policies. So for the staggered difference in difference, there is many ways to use the staggered difference in difference. Here, the approach that we are following is an approach developed by Carway and Santana, the post-econometricians, and we use this particular method because it allows for 3 reasons. The first, it allows to explore heterogeneity, so you could assume that different groups will experience different reaction to the treatment, and that goes as well as for time. So agencies might experience something in the first year different from the second year, different from the third year, and so on. The other important thing is it emphasizes the role of covariates or control variables, which is important in in the context of transit ridership, because there is many things affect transit ridership. Gas prices affect transit ridership, employment, fares, service levels. All these variables affect transit ridership. So with this approach, we could include this in the model and so control for their effect. And then the third thing is like this approach estimate like the average treatment effect on all the units, but it also allows to estimate an average treatment effect by group as well as by time period, like for each year, for example, of adoption or each agencies. So I will not go into the details. This is just like the data that we used and their sources. And as I mentioned, like these covariates are important in the context of transit, like having population, employment, gas prices, and so on. So we included all this into our model. So, and for the sake of time, I'll just go into the results directly. And the results are divided into 3 parts, and then each of them trying to answer one of the research questions that we have. Starting with the mobile fare payment application. So here, you can see in this table, we have 3 rows. The first one is the overall treatment effect. And see here we see like, this is the average treatment effect on all the treated unit. And we see that this coefficient is not significant. That means like we don't see a statistically significant effect on all of the units. And the same goes if we try to look at agencies that adopted in 2013 only, or 2014 and 2015 and so on. We don't see any significant impact. And the same if we look at the event study. If we want to see the year of the adoption, we don't see a significant effect 1 year later, 2 years later, and so on. So to conclude, we see that like this, the launch of mobile fare payment did not yield significant ridership gains. Like we saw that the different benefits that have been documented, but we didn't see any significant ridership gains. So then with the same approach, we look at the daily fare capping, and also we don't see significant impact. We see only like in 1 year, but like this 2013, like the agency was agency that had a major system change. So that's particularly capturing some of that, not the ridership gains with the daily fare capping. So if we go to the monthly, we see here, if we look into the overall treatment effect, we don't see an effect. But then when we start looking at agency group by group, we see that like agency adopted in 2017 had like about 3% increase, and then in 2018 about 4%. But the last group in 2019 did not experience significant ridership. And then if we look at the time, in the first year of the adoption, we don't see any ridership gains, but with time we see ridership increases in the first year after the adoption, and then the second year the adoption. And this is like about 3 to 4% increases. So in summary, the finding of this study suggests that like the mobile fare payment apps and the daily fare capping, they did not result in significant ridership gains, but the monthly fare cap did increase ridership. And one of the reasons that we could see like from the daily fare capping to the monthly, like the daily fare capping, most of the agencies in the United States, they said like the daily cap at 3 or 4 trips. So, and most people like take 3 or 4 trips per day. They don't have like time to do more trips. So technically, like they don't get much benefit of having ride for free. But then with the months, like if they reach the cap within like 20 days, for example, they still could benefit from riding more in the rest of the months. So these are the main findings, but like as of course there's many areas for future research. So one area for future research is like, so we see here for monthly fare capping, we see some ridership gains, but like one important aspect related to that is what's the impact of fare capping on fare revenue. So for example, if we see like 3% increase in ridership, how much of fare revenues the agencies are losing, and that's important for agencies and their sustainability. Also, change in travel behavior at the rider level are anticipated. Like here in this study, we looked at the aggregate level at the agency, but future studies could look into like who's really benefiting from that. Are the low-income riders are benefiting, or just like the regular high-income riders are just benefiting more from that? Also, we looked at large agencies, so future studies could look at medium-sized and small agencies, as well as we focus on past future studies could look into their ridership. Thank you, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Abu Bakr. I think we'll go on to the next presentation. I have a couple questions that I can post in the chat box for you, and we can, if anyone else has any other questions, they can post them there. And then we'll maybe kind of have some Q&A time at the end. So our next speaker is going to be is it Xing Tang from Penn State? Are you here and a bit ready to go?
Jason, I don't see on the group.
Oh, okay.
Oh, Priyanka, did you email him a while back?
No, I was waiting to join.
Yeah, please email anyone that we're missing. They should be here from the start. And hopefully he'll come in and we'll get him later. But the rest of you who are speaking may have more time because of this.
Yep. So our next speaker after that will be Jin-Soon Lim on dynamic usage, allocation, and pricing for curbside space operation. I believe I saw you in the room. There we are.
Hello, everyone.
Share your screen whenever you're ready.
Just give me a second.
Yep.
While I bring on my PowerPoint. Here we go. Just give me a second, please.
Jason, you can also show who's up next if we're worried. Poor Ji-Soon was not expecting to go second here. Cool, wonderful.
Thank you. Yes. Let's get started. I believe you guys see my screen, right?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Ji-Soon from the University of Michigan. I'm currently a third-year PhD student with my supervision of my advisor, Professor Nada Masood from the same department, same university. I'm delighted to talk at this conference, BTR 5 conference, about my recent work in dynamic usage allocation and pricing for curbside space operations. So let's get started. So this is a brief agenda of my talk today. First, I'm going to motivate the problem by discussing why the curb space is significant in today's transportation plannings and operations. Then I'll discuss the game theoretical model that I use to model the relationships of the different stakeholders in the game, in the curb space operation. Then I'll translate that model into a mathematical model and then propose the solution methodology to actually use that model for the real life usages. Then I'll introduce some of the numerical experiments that validates the efficiency and effectiveness of the model that I introduced, and conclude with summarizing the takeaways. So I first want to discuss what is actually curb space. So I asked our favorite friend these days, ChatGPT, what curb space is, and he gave me an answer that it is simply a space between the road and the sidewalk. That is a very high-level answer, but as you can show, until the very recent days, the planners were not paying that much attention to curb space, and they're rather neglecting the usage or just operate them in a simple usages. But as I said, now these days, the transportation infrastructure is getting modernized and connected. Its importance is growing rapidly. So as I mentioned, traditionally, there weren't that many usages for curb space. It was actually only used for street parking mostly. Of course, there are many homogeneous planning going on for this usage. So we can have dynamic pricing or a special allocation program to accommodate their demands. However, this is not elegant enough to accommodate different usages that are being used today. So today, of course, street parking is one of the primary usages, but there are also many other usages for curb spaces. For example, passenger pickup or drop-off, freight loading and unloading, EV charging stations, micromobility, or delivery pickup. So now we have to find a way to accommodate all of these usages while we have the same amount of curb space, or in fact, less amount of curb space because now the roads are more congested and crowded. So while I plan on this operation, I assert there are two considerations. And first would be the allocation of the spaces. As I said, the amount of spaces are limited, so we have to strategically plan out at what time we're gonna give how much space to each usage to accommodate varying demand. Second will be about the pricing for those spaces. Basically, this will be similar to any other dynamic pricing algorithms that are used in the transportation domain to control and satisfy the users coming into the infrastructure. So just to reiterate myself, allocation, as we can know, the number of spaces are limited in the real system, and we want to find the optimal allocation strategy to accommodate the different usages in the same infrastructure. So I say rather than having a permanent installments and constructions going on, I'll rather have a temporal changes to these allocations so I can accommodate the varying demands through dynamic allocation. Next thing is pricing. As we know, pricing strategies are prevalent in transportation systems, but for curb space management specifically, it can be used to appeal of spaces to different user types. And when this pricing is not carefully set, then it can impact on the user turnover, low satisfactions over users, and increase congestion. So this really needs a scrutiny of planning. Now I'll actually talk about the stakeholders of curb space, and I say there are two stakeholders in the big picture. First will be the curb space operator, who manages and decides policies on curb spaces, and then the second stakeholders will be the curb space users. And for this one, there will be a different users for each types, and their traits and characteristics are all different, so we have to consider them independently in our model. And all of these users, they're going to either use their curb space by accepting the policy or reject the policy and drop off from the curb space provided by the operator. So there is this kind of iterative feedback loop coming up where the operator decides on the policy and gives to the user, and the user will evaluate that policy by either accepting or rejecting the policy. And when this iterative process goes on, the whole system will find the optimal strategy to accommodate the benefits of the both. So I translate this into a game theoretical approach using the Stackelberg leader-follower game. And this game allows me to make a hierarchical decision making. I do this because, in the real life, the operator would be actually the leader of the game because they have their first hands on the infrastructure and they're going to make the first decision. Then when the leaders make the decision in this game, the users will be the followers of the game. And there will be this feedback going on between the operator and the users between the two level games. So as I said, in the beginning, I have to translate this game theoretical model to the mathematical model. And then to do so, I introduce this bi-level nonlinear optimization problem. In this problem, the operator will consist the upper level problem, and its objective will be to maximize their profit or their incentives to continue running the infrastructure. For the users, they'll consist the lower level problem, and here they're going to maximize their sum of utilities, which means they have an option for either using the infrastructure or participating in outside options because the policy given by the operators cannot satisfy their needs. So let's take a deeper look into a mathematical model. So for the upper level model, for the operator, we can see there are sets of constraints. They're deciding the allocation and pricing policy. But I want to also focus on constraint 1M, which is the very last constraint, because this constraint links the upper level model to the lower level model. Here you can see the constraint 1M is defining the Q variables, as you can see in the yellow box, and the Q variables depict the occupancy or the participation of the users abiding by the policy given by the upper level problem. As I said, for the lower level problem, it is defining the Q variables using the argument function, and here the users are either accepting or rejecting the policy given by the P vector, as they can see on constraint 2A. So here there are two utility functions introduced, utility function F and H, and they each correspond to the case where the users accept or reject the policy. And and the user will make a choice between the two functions and take on the value whichever gives the higher utility. After introducing this model, we want to use this for the real studies. However, it is widely known that this bi-level structure gives a lot of difficulties such as disconnectedness, non-convexity, and intractability. Of course, we want to use this model for real-life cases. So I have to come up with a solution methodology which will tackle these three difficulties, and I do so by introducing the KKT reformulation, objective function reformulation, and vendors decomposition. So let's start with the KKT reformulation. So what we do here is we adopt the KKT definitions to the lower level problem, and using that definition, we reformulate the lower level problem so it can be appended to the upper level problem. So this step will connect the two parts that were disconnected, and it will the new program will now exhibit the single level structure. And this enables us to go through further transformations and adopt solution methodologies for use to be in real time. Second is the objective function transformation. What we do here is basically convexify the objective function. This is the key because in many optimization problems, convexity is the key of reaching the global optimality. After going through like piecewise linear approximations and convexifying the nonlinear terms, this finally enables us to use the single level problem in the standard MILP solvers that are widely used in the field. Finally, even if I convexify the problem, there is still a challenge because of the scale or the size of the problem. So what I want to do now with this linearized and convexified problem, I want to reinstate the block structure by dividing strategically dividing the problem into two parts, namely the master problem and the sub problem. This is a mathematical algorithm that allows to revive this iterative process where the master problem will decide the policy and the sub problem will provide the approximation of how that policy will be reacted by the users. This algorithm, because it is partitioning the programs into various numerous parts, it saves the memory consumptions or the CPU time of solving the model. Although I will not go into this detail in this particular presentation, I also adopt some branch algorithms under vendor decomposition to facilitate the calculations of the model. Finally, it is now time to introduce some of the experiment results. I want to introduce two results. First, to validate the efficiency of the solution methodology, and second is just to brainstorm the example of the curve space operation strategy planned out by the model. So I want to briefly discuss about the experimental setups. To test in a variety of cases, I defined three different sizes of scenarios where each of those scenarios introduce heterogeneous zones of curve spaces. In this case, we can accommodate very different zone characteristics or the user characteristics that differs by zones. I adopt 4 different user types, namely the parking, pickup, drop-off, fire loading, unloading, and micro-mobility. And also they will have different traits and conditions. They will have different utilities based on what the operator is giving it to them. For the utility functions, you can see there are 2 data values, data price and data occupancy, and they are the 2 sensitivity factors for the utility functions. For the user utility function F, you can see the base utility decreases as the user sensitivity on pricing or occupancy increases, or the data's increase. And for the outside option dropout utility H, you can see their base utility increases as the sensitivity increases. So basically, as any of those factors increases, we want to find the balance point or where the 2 functions cross each other, and that will be the equilibrium point for the users. Let's start with the solution algorithm efficiency investigation. We can see that the vendor decomposition algorithm shows strengths in reporting real-time solutions, which means they can go to find the first feasible solution more quickly and report the higher quality solutions at termination. if you look at the right table, I'm comparing all the randomly generated experiments for the single, 2, and 3 zone scenarios. And for most of the cases, Bender's decomposition is producing more quality solution than the solver or the benchmark solutions. On the left, we can also see what I do is I visualize the average performance of the single and 2 zone scenarios. And you can see the blue lines, which depict the Bender's decomposition algorithms, is having much faster convergence that reaches the optimality compared to the benchmark solutions in gray lines. Finally, I want to outline some of the curve space operations that are produced by the game model that I use. For the pricing, we can see that as price sensitivity increases, the pricing decisions to retain the users, the pricing will decrease to retain the users. The 4 figures that I have here shows how the price decreases as the price sensitivity increases. So as the lines get darker, it shows the scenario where the price sensitivity increases, which means the users are more sensitive to the price changes. You can see as the lines gets darker, the prices will go down to retain the users and prevent dropouts. For the occupancy, I can see that even if the prices also has some influence of the users' responses, the occupancy sensitivity actually has more influence than price sensitivity through my model. What that means is right now what I do in these heat maps is that for the 4 different usages, I kind of take a photo in a one-time epoch and see how the users are reacting differently when the price and occupancy sensitivity factors are different. The top 2 cases show when the occupancy sensitivity is low, and the bottom 2 shows when the occupancy sensitivity is high. And the first and third row shows when the price sensitivity is low, and the second and fourth row shows when the price sensitivity is high. We can see that the first 2 cases looks very similar, and the bottom 2 cases exhibits a very similar results, which means the users are more sensitive to the occupancy changes rather than the price changes. Finally, I want to discuss about the operator utility, basically how the operator will suggest different policies to retain their users and retain their utility. When the price sensitivity increases, what happens is, as you can see in the right figure, when the price sensitivity is low, they're gonna primarily focus on serving the pickup, drop-off, or loading, unloading demands because they exhibit the higher demand and higher revenue from the users. However, when the price sensitivity starts to increase, because to retain their users, they cannot increase their highest to their maximum values, they're gonna start shifting to the other usages like parking or micromobility usages to retain their utility. When the occupancy sensitivity changes, we can see that now the system starts to provide more uniform services across all usages, and that is because when the occupancy sensitivity increases, it is not beneficial to target 1 or 2 specific usages, because when their occupancy increases, their base utility is going to decrease and it's going to hurt the overall utility. Whereas when the price sensitivity, the occupancy sensitivity is low, we're going to say, because it's not going to hurt the system to strategically decide which users to serve, the operator will rather focus on the demands that gives high utility to them. To summarize my talk, I presented this work in 3 steps. First, I suggested the curve space modeling through a stackable later follower game, and I translate this mathematical model for the real-time tractability by complexifying the problem and introducing the Bender's decomposition solution algorithm. Finally, I introduced some of the numerical experiment studies to show the practicability of my model. This is the end of my talk. I will open the floor for questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, maybe we can maybe take a minute for one question. I see we have a question in the chat box. So, excuse me. So Kara Koppelman's wondering, how well does this scale up to real systems, and references Hunter et al.'s paper about parking spots a year or two ago was an example of that.
So that is a great question. Of course, the model should be applicable for the real life scenarios and cases. That is why I introduced the vendor decomposition solution algorithm. The last scenario with the 3 zones that accommodates over 100 curb spaces, which are dispersed out in the 3 zones. We are in the key for the real life adaptation will be the finding the good shape of the utility functions that really accommodates the user traits for the different types of users. But I assert that the algorithm can exhibit a quality solution for the real life instances. Also, another key would be the data collection, because right now I'm randomly generating instances. I did it flexible enough so it can accommodate any given scenarios, but of course I will have to go through the real life case studies to see whether that flexibility can actually accommodate the real life scenarios.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So I think our next speaker is from the same research group from University of Michigan. And I also was just noticing this isn't by design. We have 2 speakers with very similar names to my own. So our next speaker, is it Yasin Liagas?
Yeah.
Great. Feel free to share your screen whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Okay.
I think you just need to switch so that you're sharing the presentation. We're seeing your presenter view.
Do you see now my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm presenting the Serviceman problem. The authors of this paper is Jason Lim, myself, and our supervisor, Dr. Neda Masood. Now, the characteristics of the Serviceman problem is that we aim to allocate servicemen within a map to collect the maximum utility by serving tasks, and then reroute them in an optimal way by the minimum path. And now each serviceman is heterogeneous from everybody else, which means that everybody has a different routing speed and a different completion of the task speed. And we also apply vendors as a solution methodology to scale the solution as well. And we try to prove, like, for which cases, we try to examine for which cases vendors outperforms the commercial solver. Now, there are some similar problems in the literature. So some very well known is the traveling salesman problem, that we have one agent who wants to visit a certain amount of cities and then come back to the original node. But in this case, there is no selection of which cities he's going to collect utility. Also, there is the traveling purchasing problem, that the agent chooses which cities to visit and to collect utility. And then there is the orienteering problem and the vehicle routing problem, trying to distribute a good, starting from a certain depot and then coming back. But there are some differences between some major differences between the serviceman problem and the aforementioned problem. So the differences are that we're taking into account as a constraint not any budget constraint, and not any vehicle constraint or serviceman capacity or vehicle capacity. Rather than we only care about the time. So we want to use like every serviceman with the optimal time to collect the maximum revenue. And yeah, so the decision variables are binary. So it's about floating of the serviceman. U, X is their location, Y is their ability to serve. So it's one when they are able to serve. And Z is a binary variable that is one if in a particular node there is a serviceman who is able to serve a task, and there is also a task to be served. And then the parameters are some indicators like H, which indicates if we have a task on an existing node. M is the shortest path time for each particular serviceman to go from node I to node J. Then L is the completion time for each particular task by each serviceman, which is different. C is the task utility, and A is the cost per time unit traveled by the serviceman. So the model formulation is the following. In the objective function, we want to maximize the total utility collected by the serviceman, while also minimizing the time cost between relocating the serviceman. So in the first four constraints are concerned with the relocation of servicemen, and then from 1F to 1J, we have the matching of tasks to servicemen, the optimal matching. So which is, for example, that we cannot have more than one serviceman in one particular node. Each serviceman has to stay in his position until he completes the task. He cannot move. And then each serviceman, when he operates on a task, he cannot get a second task on the same node on the same time. So everybody has to finish their task, their operating task first to find something else, even if this is on the same node. And then constraints 1G and 1H that define Z, what I described before, that we have an available serviceman to serve in a node with a task on it. So in order to scale this problem, we apply Bender's decomposition. So let me just describe briefly what is Bender's. Like it partitions the problem, the integer program, to a master problem and a sub problem with the aim to simplify the overall solution. So by solving iteratively the master problem and the sub problem, we aim to have a better efficiency in reaching to an optimal solution. And this happens through cuts, which are some constraints that are added to the master problem sequentially to help us approximate our initial problem. So the steps of the algorithm is we start from a particular feasible solution of the master problem, and then we solve the sub problem. We find with the fixed variables we had from the master problem. Then the sub problem, in the sub problem, if it is infeasible for those particular complicating variables, we generate a feasibility cut. And then if the sub problem is feasible, we check the gap, which is the upper bound minus the lower bound. Upper bound is obtained by the master problem, and we can infer the upper bound from the master problem, and we can infer the lower bound from the sub problem. And if the gap is not small enough, then we generate an optimality cut, which would help us approximate the original problem better through the solution of the master problem. Or otherwise, if the gap is small enough, we stop there and we're done. And then we operate this process repeatedly. Again, with the master problem, we take the complicating variables, values, and so on. So what we want is to put on the master problem the variables that are named complicated because they usually make our problem non-linear. If they are binary, this removes the linearity. And the rest of the problem has to be ideally it should be linear, or at least it should be convex. The sub-problem, what remains. So in our case, we will take the matching of the serviceman to task will be the master problem, and we'll keep those relating constraints from our main problem. And then below we see here we have 2B, which is the optimality cut, and 2C, which is the feasibility cuts that are being added iteratively after each iteration. And I will explain further how these equations are being built. Then we have the sub problem, which is the optimal routing, the equations, the constraints that we had from our initial problem, and the part of the objective function that minimizes their relocation time. So now our variable is binary, so it's not very simple. But we can observe that from the constraint matrix of those equations from 1B to 1E of our formulation, our initial formulation, 1B to 1E, like they create a coefficient matrix that is totally unimodular. This means that we can solve its relaxation and still get integer solution. So in that case, we lift this final constraint of 3B. It's not needed. So now we have our remaining linear sub-problem. Now, since the sub-problem is linear, we can use these dual values to generate the cuts. The lambdas we see here are the dual variable solutions of our sub-problem. So from the sub-problem dual. Okay. And those are added sequentially after each iteration. When the values we get from the master problem are create a feasible solution for the sub-problem, we generate 2B. On the iteration that complicating variables generate an infeasible problem, then we get a constraint added to the master problem of 2C type. Okay. And then in order to speed up the algorithm, one thing we do is we start from an initial feasible solution that takes the maximum that sorts the tasks in a decreasing order, and we take the first K task with the highest utility to get, and we give them randomly to our K servicemen. So we start from a very good optimal point to collect maximum utility from the beginning. And then the other thing we do is we add some valid inequalities to the master problem. So the first one is that dictates that every serviceman can be in one node in every timestamp. And then the second one is that each serviceman has to remain in his node until serving the task has finished. They already exist in the sub-problem, but they help the master problem to produce better solutions and avoid infeasibilities. Okay, so now in the final section, the experiments that we try to see in some small size problems, medium size problems, and large size problems, if the Bender's decomposition outperforms the commercial solver solution time. So as we see here on the left, we have 10 experiments of small size with 10 nodes and 10 timestamps and 3 servicemen. The gap among those 10, as it evolves with time, you can see here with the darker red line, and the dotted black line horizontal is the gap of the solver, which is almost 0, and we have faster time. Like the solver is has reached optimality on the vertical line. So we see that for small experiments, the commercial solver outperforms the Bender's algorithm. And here we can see again the upper bound with this red line, lower bound, and then the solution from the solver and the time that we obtained the solution, around half a second. So again, for those type of problems, very clear, solver wins. Now for medium-sized problems, again, and with added, like the red lines is the gap with the valid inequalities that help the master problem. We observe that again, for 30 nodes and 30 timestamps and 10 servicemen, the commercial solver outperforms Bender's algorithm. But when we increase to 50 nodes and 50 time steps for 5 servicemen, we see for the first time that on average, for 10 experiments of that size, the Bender's decomposition outperforms the commercial solver, and we have a smaller optimality gap sooner. And the previous, these are the results that that presented in the previous figures. Like we see here, like in the smaller examples, the commercial solver outperformed Bender's for most of the cases, but for the medium, Bender's worked more efficient, medium sizes. And then for large sizes, we observe again that in most of the cases, Bender's outperforms the commercial solver. Thank you. Any questions?
Hey, Jason, I was asking Jisun in the text box via direct message about Bender's, because I saw everybody was using it just a couple of weeks ago in Chicago at Inform's logistics conference. And so it sounds like it speeds things up quite a bit in really big problems. And so there's lots of applications for you there. Among that program, if you look at that, Isan, I think you'll find a lot of neat applications that relate to what you're doing.
Yeah, this is something that can be like widely applied. The only thing that has to be satisfied is that this helps remove illinearities. So we can have something. We could have alleviate illinearities in the master problem. The only requirement is that in our sub problem has to be convex. So and then we can decompose our problem. So when the size increases, because when we have more constraints, like the more constraints we have, and the problem solution time increases exponentially. And as the problem size increases, we observe that it is faster to solve 2 smaller problems than one with the same size. If we break it down and the size is large enough, then we go into this area that the 2 smaller problems, it's better to solve the 2 smaller problems than one that is
oh yeah, yeah, that happens all the time with matrices, for sure. The number of cells is just unbelievable. It's too bad they can't break it farther. But I know in machine learning, they often, will randomly sample and train again and again, and then use ensembles of those solutions to avoid it. And this sort of reminds me a little bit of genetic algorithms too, perhaps, that might be useful in some of these settings. Thanks. Yeah,
genetic algorithms are used in this kind of problems, but I believe Bender's is better because when you use genetic algorithms, you're never sure about if you have reached global optimality. But Bender's guarantees that you have the optimality gap, and say you're satisfied. Like in our experiments, we run with 1%, but say you're satisfied with 5% or whatever it is. You have reached optimality within 1% or 5%. But with genetic algorithms, you can never be sure that what you see is not a local optimum.
Yeah,
so it's
the
always
real
better.
problems. You know,
Yeah,
real
it-
problems like Waymo or I don't know, Uber and Lyft and stuff are happening so fast, nobody's going to solve them and they're too big. So you definitely have to go with some kind of heuristic, I think, for real.
Okay, yeah, if it's a matter of speed, yeah, then the heuristic algorithms win. Yeah,
Thanks.
they are a very good guess of the solution. This is
So
how I
maybe I had a
characterize.
point of clarification. I'm not an OR person, but I'm roughly familiar with the method and that. So this serviceman problem that you're solving, is this a new problem or
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was just kind of curious. It's because it's practically speaking, looking at optimization in terms of service time, it seems like it would be something that would have been examined before, node service time. But it's interesting that it hasn't been examined in this way. Okay.
Yeah. So there are some.
So then the main contribution here is that you're solving this new problem, and so you have kind of these. You have to sort of run these different optimizations. Looking at what the timing is for it.
Yeah, exactly.
I think
This is
I again sort of similar to kind of the previous presentation is how do you kind of go from this small, medium, large problem to solving this on a real network?
Yeah, it depends on if you have, for example, if we had a real network, it always depends on the size and how much details would we like to include, like from reality. Would it be an approximate network with the biggest routes, or would we include everything? But if we did this, then we would go directly for vendors. This is the conclusion basically of the paper. It would be way more preferable to go directly for vendors.
Yeah. So I guess what sort of a question, applied question, could you look at with this model compared to something like a traveling salesman or vehicle routing problem? How is this going to differ from that?
Putting off fires or delivering things like
okay.
Yeah, but it's things that we would care more about the time rather than the cost.
Okay, yeah, so it's maybe, so like, a vehicle routing problem, you're maybe dropping something off, but for something like a fire, there's a service time or
the police, police deployment, like where would you usually deploy the police officers within a city? And this would be something else, like how much time should they stay and things like that. Yeah.
Okay, very, very interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
If I can just interrupt briefly, because I'm also a co-author of this paper. So like that, I mean, I see the main contribution could be that this problem not only, so like you mentioned like PSP or VRP, they mainly focus on visiting some set of nodes, like some set of locations. What we want to expand on is like, when we visit those places, we want to have like heterogeneous or multiple periods of times that the serviceman or a personnel will have to stay at those nodes. For example, like, Jason, I think mentioned about police deployment or like any types of services. Like, based on what needs each of the nodes need, like for some particular usage, they can be satisfied within seconds. Some other services, it can require multiple time periods to satisfy the task. So regarding the service time, most of the models that have been previously studied had that homogeneous or short period of time that required for the service. Whereas for the serviceman problem that we were suggesting, it can accommodate a wide range of service times. And we will know that ex ante, so we will know that beforehand. But the model can represent how those relationships between the service times and the servicemen deployed can be modeled through our model.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think if there's other questions, we can kind of address them at the end, but we'll maybe move on to our next presenter, who is Ali Mohammadi, presenting on
Hi, Jason.
essential factors in swapping rundown land into transit-oriented apartments.
Hi, Jason. Do you have my voice?
Yep, I hear you. So if you want to share your screen.
Yes, of course.
Great.
Do you have my screen now?
Yes, I do now.
I share my screen. Hi, everybody. My name is Ali Mohammadi. I hope you are doing well. And I want to talk about today about our study regarding the essential factors in swapping rundown land into transit-oriented apartment. The problem is that rundown area, many cities around the world contain some areas which are known as rundown area, which are characterized like small size lots, inadequate accessibility, structural instability in front of earthquake, and limited access to some facilities, for example, retailer stores, schools, library, and the others. In this regard, Tehran, the capital of Iran, have the population of around 8.5 million people, and about 70% of these people living in rundown areas. That you can see that in the map. Moreover, another problem is that Iran is located in the seismic belt, and the history showed that each 150 years, Tehran experienced an earthquake with magnitude of 7 Richter. And today, from the last earthquake past 180 years, 30 years more than the average, and each day and each time, the scientific expect that earthquake happen again, and they believe if an earthquake with the magnitude of 6 Richter scale happen, a human tragedy will be happen. Plenty of solutions proposed in these years for solving this problem, and one of the new solution is known as multi-agent programming strategy, which is known as public-private partnership. In this policy, 3 agents, residents, governments, and private sector should be collaborating together and try to solve the problem and relocate people from the rundown areas to new built apartment which have a good accessible to public transportation. Each of the agent, for example, have a cost. For example, the residents should give the rundown areas to the government. The government should try to build the rapid transit lines, and the private sector try to build the new apartment and investigate in this plan. And each of them have some benefits and profits. For example, the residents get the new apartment, which is safe in front of earthquake. The government can solve and have a better traffic in the short term and green space. And in the long term, the government have a better and safe place in front of earthquake. And it decreases the cost for government and can save the life of people. And the private sector, in front of building new commercial and building areas for people, they can invest. They can utilize from the commercial building in a long-term years. And it's clear the success of such a strategy depends on the rates of people trade off their rundown land area for a newly easily accessible apartment, which is have a good accessible to BRT lines. And when we can decrease this new trade-off rate, the chance of success for this policy for this plan will be increased. Five scenarios was proposed in this plan. In the first plan, in the stated preference survey, wanted from the residents of this area and ask them how they want to relocate and from a current location to new residential building which is accessible 50 minutes from their current location. And the question was how much meter they want new apartment in front of to they give their lands to the government. It was the first scenario, but the second scenario it's similar to the first scenario and just added some rapid transit lanes which are accessible in 10 minutes to near new residential building. The third scenario it's also an incentive scenario and added some facilities like as retail stores in 5 minutes and school and hospital in 10 minutes in the new current location. And the fourth scenario added again some facilities and as like commercial building and green space with 15-minute accessibility from the new build apartment. And in each scenario, we wanted the residential and asked them how much meter they wanted new apartment. But the first scenario was a command control scenario, and is opposed to the first four scenario. We asked them if we have a restriction and limitation for the new apartment, and just the person who wanted less and fewer smaller floor, they can relocate to the new apartment, and we want them to answer this question again. Literature review showed that plenty of researchers try to find the answer of and the influencing factor on residential relocation of people, and some of them studied objective variables, some of them focus on subjective variables, and some of them try to find some built environment characteristics that have significant impact on residential relocation decisions. But our study was in continue the study of that done with Soleimani and Purzahedi, and we want to add some extra features to their studies. The question is actually we want to know how the new scenarios that offer in this plan can decrease the chance of people change their house, and how it influence on the property owner building to land the rate of their decisions. Moreover, we added some built environment characteristic, and we want to know how for example, density, diversity of each census tract have effect on the people decisions. For that, we used the data from this study that was 882 well-reported survey that collected with face-to-face with the head of each household in these areas. And we added some data regarding to built environment characteristic that was extracted from the Atlas of Tehran metropolis. A brief description of the data show that 15% of head of these the sample of people who live in this area are female, and 89% of them of the major races, and they are Farsi or Azeri, and just 11% are others. Plenty of them doesn't have academic education, and most of them doesn't have a suitable income, and it showed that around 780% of them have a monthly income less than $200, which show that the people who are living in this area are vulnerable, and they cannot themselves change their circumstance and their houses. And the average age of the head is 57 years old. and around 42% of them are retired or unemployed, and they do not have a good job situation. As you can see, plenty of these spaces, these houses doesn't have a good parking space, and more than 72% of these people living in that area more than 15 years, which show that these people have historical memory from these places, and it's and about 39% of them, and more than 61% of them have a nostalgia memory, which can lead that they restrict around the relocation. First of all, in the analysis of data, we use the factor analysis to extract some subjective variables that you can see in this table. First, some of the attitudes, for example, government dependency that is recognized and extracted from the data. Government dependency shows that some people believe that the government is responsible to change their circumstance and resolve the problem. And for example, another attitude is corporative activity, that these people believe that for changing their life, they should cooperate with the government or private sector. And moreover, it has social and the other conservative attitudes. We have also attitudes regarding the residential attitudes, for example, pro-highly accessibility, pro-safety, and pro-low density. This study, we also have some latent variable that was regarding to satisfaction. And for example, the security satisfaction that showed that people feel safe and secure in their living areas now. And the other was traffic, welfare service, and access. And in these maps, you can see the distribution of some main built environment characteristic, for example, population density, residential density, and the other that was extracted from the idea of that was come from the several studies. And it was this is the main figure in this study, show that come from the description of data that and show that when we offered the people and we wanted them to answer this question, how many new built apartment they want to give their rundown area. First of all, the answer is if we offer them 0, it's the rate of that. It's 0, 100% will be restricted, and the maximum rate that we propose to them is the 4. For example, if 1% area is now 50 meters, we offer the maximum 200 meters, and we didn't go ahead after that. And we can see 10% people also this place will be restricted. They have residents. They do not give their and wanted to change their houses. Methodology that was used for this study was the random effect hazard, and we tested both variable distribution and exponential distribution, and the results show that the variable distribution has a better fix in this regard. Our results show that each scenario 2, 3, 4, and 5, in comparison to scenario 1, can decrease the rate of people and there are the built environment to trade off. Moreover, the built environment characteristics such as population density, employment density, and entropy has significant effect. And in other groups such as accessibility, government attitudes, residential attitudes, social economic, and home characteristic, all of them has a significant effect on people decision. For example, people who are living in an area for less than 5 years old, it shows that they do not have a historical memory from that place, and they are ready to relocate their house with a lower trade-off ratio. And the sensitive analysis is done in this study and show in each BTR trade-off ratio, people are ready to change and our probability of to restrict to relocation. For example, for scenario, each scenario when we added new facilities to our plan, we can decrease the probability of we can increase the probability of the people accept our plan and decrease the ratio of their acceptance. But really important that we see the fourth scenario, that's command control, and it's not an instinctive scenario. It is more, it has a better and effect on the people decision, because when people feel a risk, they decrease their restriction in front of our plan. Other sensitive analysis on the other variables have happened in these studies. You can see in this figure, each of the variables have a different effect on the people decision. And for example, in the first figure, we can see the population density has a more effect on the people's decisions in comparison to entropy and job density. And the effect of accessibility is less than the other variables, other built environment variables. And in attitudes variable, the government dependency has more effect on people decisions, and people who believe that the government is responsible for changing their life, they have more restricted in comparison of our proposed plan. And this figure, the other, the sensitive analysis in relation to other attitudes was shown. Our key findings is that adopting restrictive policies can enhance flexibility in lowering trade-off rates. Moreover, property owners in vibrant neighborhoods with favorable built environment characteristics are less likely to request lower trade-off rates, even when guaranteed relocation with the same neighborhoods. And individual prioritizing high accessibility when selecting a new place to live tend to settle at lower trade-off rates. Those satisfied with the security level of their living conditions prefer higher trade-off ratio. Property owners living in a masonry building are more inclined to request lower trade-off rates, and ground floor residents are more reluctant to relocate and prefer greater trade-off rate. And in conclusion, this study provides planner, decision maker, and policy maker a quantitative method to evaluate the effect of various objective and subjective variables on BTR trade-off decisions, and which can help them to provide plans which are best aligned to property owners' needs and built environment characteristics of each living area, and are consistent with the budgetary resource of the plan. Thanks for your attention. I'm here for your question.
Great. Thanks very much, Ali. I see Kara Kalkman has a few questions and comments in the chat box. We can maybe kind of address
Ali,
one,
is Iran really doing this with like thousands of households?
Yes, exactly. It was really hard to collect this data. Face to face.
Well, it's just amazing that they have the money to do this. I would love to see this happen all over the place. Yeah, that's just wonderful that they're able to help a lot of households with this. But yeah, I'm sorry that they have to offer a bigger dwelling unit to get most of the people to pursue this.
Thanks.
So we'll maybe move on to our last speaker, and then we can come back to some of these questions and discussion at the end. Or obviously you can answer them in the chat box. Our last speaker is Shimbo Yu, who is at the University of California, Irvine as a postdoc, but it looks like he also has many other appointments. So I'll hand it off to Shinbo, but before I do that, I just will say it's kind of funny that I appreciate that I've had many correspondence with Shinbo because we missed out on some of his presentations, and he continues to insist on calling me Dr. Hawkins, despite the fact I think you got your PhD before me. So
yeah, I'll call you Jason from now on.
Okay, I'll hand it off then.
Thanks. Let me just I still can't share my screen right now.
I think you were made a co-host, so you should be able to now.
Yeah, now you can.
Okay.
Great.
Okay. How's my screen right now?
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. Hello everyone. My name is Jumbo. It's a pleasure today to talk about how maximizing the synergies of human intelligence and artificial intelligence could improve the adaptiveness of transportation planning and policymaking. The focus of my talk will be on the motivations, analytical framework, and a preliminary case study. And the framework, in a sense, is an integration of several of my, in a sense, foreshadowing papers in the past 5 years. So although urban transportation systems are rather complex, they can be generally understood or viewed as feedback systems where system decision makers impose actions through things like projects, policies, and control strategies onto urban mobility systems to influence how urban system state has evolved. And system decision makers can then collect information from the systems. Although not all information are clearly observable due to sensor limitations or privacy protection laws, so they might have to infer the system state and performance using observable information. System decision maker can adjust their decisions based on a certain policy, which can be as explicit as regulations or algorithms, or as implicit as guidelines, rule of thumbs, organizational culture, or conventions. However, disruptive events from exogenous or endogenous sources might occur, which might render previous plans of future actions to be outdated. While it makes sense to simply update plans accordingly, such updates usually involve significant cost and burden, which is often considered impossible given the agency's financial and labor constraints. Even if it's possible, the update usually takes months or even years. Therefore, here I propose to utilize the joint power of human intelligence and artificial intelligence to speed up this feedback process and improve its quality. Fostering human AI collaboration or human AI teaming offers potentially numerous benefits for planning and managing infrastructure and mobility systems. By leveraging the strengths of both humans and AI, we could create more efficient and effective transportation systems that are better able to meet the needs of users and the society at large. However, there is a wide range of possibilities in terms of how human and AI could form teams. So we need a general framework to model and evaluate different alternatives, and ideally, the models instantiated from such a framework should be able to suitable for optimization algorithms so that we can actually find the optimal composition and information flow of such human AI teams. So here I propose a tri-component framework for evaluating various alternatives of human AI teaming. The three components are urban dynamics, disruptive events with hidden processes, and a cognition and behaviors of humans and AI and their interactions. So next, I will use a case study on strategic transportation planning in San Diego County, California, to demonstrate the potential use of such a tri-component framework. So although the first component, the urban dynamics models, is essentially about really finding the function of F here to capture the dynamics or the involvement of this urban systems that as a function of both the current existing system state as well as the corresponding action at that time step. but clearly specifying such a function is a challenge. In a sense, over the past few decades or so, machine learning models have been used widely for finding or approximating function f. In these cases, AI can take big data from various sources and combine it with other knowledge, including existing models developed by other humans and AI to develop highly accurate, complex deep neural network models, for example. And machine learning models can then take the system's data and then to provide various recommendations. However, these models become so complex, it's very hard to explain to the decision makers and to get the feedbacks from them. So therefore, here an interpretable model or state-space model or dynamic model is really desired for finding such a function f. The main idea of such a model can be demonstrated using a hydraulic analogy. That is, we can interpret a state variable in a state space model as a set of connected reservoirs. Using this interpretation, we can map the hidden state of the space models to stock and flows, and write out the actual system of differential equations quite rigorously to describe the flows flowing among different stocks for reservoirs. This makes the model more interpretable as human experts can relate their models with their familiar life experiences. In addition to enhancing human AI communication for development and application of urban dynamics models, this approach has multiple key advantages, such as flexible resolution and scopes, low computational burden, and allowing rigorous analysis on the stability, equilibrium, reachability of the systems, in addition to its compatibility with the various optimization algorithms, such as reinforcement learning and adaptive control. So I used this approach to develop an urban dynamics model for the San Diego region of California. Although it is perhaps easier to visualize using a hydraulic analogy as shown in the previous slide, it is essentially a system of ordinary differential equations with a Markov decision process properties, in which a stock flow approach or view can capture the simplified dynamics and that such as the generalized highway capacity, household accessibility, business dynamics, and then the corresponding household dynamics and their interactions. Discrete events are common in transportation systems. These events can be as small as ride-sharing customers being matched with or rejected by drivers, or as disruptive as technical breakthroughs and major construction project delays or cancellations. Usually a discrete event, such as the infrastructure collapse, is a result of the accumulation of factors such as traffic load, environment, and historical rainfalls and small earthquakes. So a model should have the capability to capture those latent processes. So a natural next question is how to model them, preferably in line with such a interpretable state-space representation approach I just mentioned. To address this challenge, I propose a general principle called a stochastic accumulation to threshold, or SATS principle. The idea of this modeling approach is that the occurrence or non-occurrence of an event is a result of a stochastic accumulation process that allows endogenous drift rate. This way, we can capture both occurrence and the latent duration of a disruptive event. Additionally, this approach is quite scalable to cases where a hidden process can lead to more than just two possible outcomes. So in 2018, my collaborator and I proposed to use a single framework to model the cognition and behaviors and their of AI and humans and AI, and their interactions. And here in this case study, I used the reinforcement learning to instantiate this idea of this unified approach. Reinforcement learning was initially proposed in psychology to explain the learning and behaviors of animals and humans, and later significantly developed and generalized by other fields such as computer science, statistics, and cybernetics. I here map the general reinforcement learning components in the context of adaptive transportation planning. I combined three components for this particular case study and developed an algorithm, which is based on the actor-critic reinforcement learning approach with urban dynamics models as the quote-unquote environment and the simulated human decision maker in the loop. This method enabled a dynamic adjustment to predetermined infrastructure projects and policies, allowing transportation plans to adapt and respond to changing circumstances. The resilience of the transportation systems is captured by incorporating this measure in a multi-objective reward function. By incorporating the latest urban dynamics information, this approach facilitates non-myopic decision-making, speeds up the recovery, and ensures that transportation plan is up to date, while taking into account the penalty associated with the plan change. I also examined the relationship between the degree of adaptiveness of the transportation plan and the frequency of the disruptive events, and then the corresponding magnitude. The preliminary results show that the impact of benefit-cost ratios of incorporating adaptive planning depends highly on the scenarios. For example, when we double the disaster frequency, the original 4-year fixed strategy caused the loss of cumulative rewards by about 11.7%. While the adaptive strategy of 20% change penalty only caused a 6.1% reduction, which indicates that the adaptive strategy is superior. On the other hand, if we cut the disruptive event frequency by half, the original fixed 4-year planning update strategy actually shows better expected performance. This scenario sensitivity result clearly warrants more scenario testing for future and future research. So in conclusion, I here propose to use the synergies of human intelligence and artificial intelligence for more resilient and adaptive transportation systems. I proposed a modeling framework with 3 major components to allow concrete analysis and evaluation of various human AI teaming alternatives. Lastly, I also want to bring our attention to some ethical issues. One of them is that when human interacts with humans, when AI interacts with humans, the AI might start explicitly learning how to frame and manipulate human decision makers, and therefore disturb future research and discussions. And I appreciate your attention and thank you for your time. And then please let me know if you are interested in this topic and want to discuss more. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So are there any questions from the audience? I don't see any in the chat box, but if you feel free to add any questions for any of our speakers at this point, I think.
Does anybody have something they want to present? Priyanka hasn't been able to get this guy, although she did write him several times before the meeting over the past couple of years. So
yeah. So
I can ask.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you asked a question, Jason, earlier about the daily and monthly cap after COVID.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can respond
Sure.
quickly to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, we totally agree that like post-COVID, this thing have changed significantly. Like the commuting is not the same. So actually, in like one of our studies that also looked at fare capping, we proposed like these daily and monthly, like they are not gonna be the appropriate in the future. Like people right now are mainly commuting part-time, most of the people, so agencies should think about something different. So a couple of things that they could adapt is like looking at other time periods, like maybe 3 days or 5 days. I think one of the agencies in Connecticut, they have that, and it's nice, that give people more flexibility. Or even like so most of the fare capping in the United States right now is like what's called value-based, like when you reach a certain value, like $100 or something like that, agencies could move, like do a slight change and just do a trip-based fare capping, which like say like take 10 trips a week and then ride for free for the rest, which is just like a simple transformation, because like all the fares in the United States mostly are fixed fare. Like if you just multiply the single trip by the number of the single trip fare by the number of trips, you will get like the same value for capping. So if agencies start to market that as a number of trips, that might be more easier, be more applicable post-COVID, like say, hey, just take 5 trips, sorry, not 5 trips, maybe 10 trips a week or 30 trips a month or something like that. And then you get the rest for free. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was just, I was thinking, with people not necessarily driving to work or commuting to work every day of the week, you might have more people who are hesitant to pay, the full cost of a monthly transit pass because they worry that they're not going to, recoup the cost. And so having these kinds of daily or monthly limits, it kind of gives people a bit of reassurance that, you pay for what you use up to if, what you would have previously paid in that monthly pass. So it seems like I've obviously, I've seen these things before, but it seems like a strategy that makes more sense now as we're starting to see some of those shifts. So, okay, yeah, very interesting. I had a question for Jinbo, not necessarily about your presentation, but just kind of generally on this topic of human AI. One of the questions that often comes up with these sorts of systems, there's been a few books written about it, is this idea of algorithmic bias, or that, the people who are constructing these systems introduce some sort of a bias into the system. So it's not necessarily on, directly on your presentation, but I thought you might have kind of some thoughts on that in the transportation space.
And the key idea here I'm proposing is to taking the human decision makers, including the programmers, into account. So I think it's important to actually quantitatively and qualitatively model people as well as the AI into the same bigger systems or feedback loop in order to really understand whether there's such a bias or various potential issues, and if there is a potential issue, how I can avoid it. But yeah, you raise a great point, and I think that's one of the argument why I think modeling humans and both humans and AI, including the human programmers, as part of the transportation system is critical for in the future to make sure the future transportation system is actually serving the people, not the AI.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's a daunting task, but I just think it's but it's still important, I think.
Yeah, very interesting. Any other questions for any of our speakers?
We could just open it up for random conversation as we wait for the next session, or you guys can head into the other 2 tracks that are going on. There's going to be 4 tracks in about 15 minutes.
Yeah, so maybe I can I'll kind of maybe give a bit of a preview of the upcoming sessions. So our next track, which will start at 1 p.m. Central Time, we have a session that'll be on equity and accessibility in transportation, which is a growth which is great to see. It's a growing focus in a lot of transportation. We have another session on travel demand and transportation choice, which I think Jinbo is also presenting in on a different topic. And then we have a session on active transportation and emotion, and then a 4th session in this afternoon, which is going to be from ITBR, the International Association of Travel Behavior Researchers, a special session focused on physiological sensor data use in travel behavior models. So this is kind of a emerging field in travel behavior. And we have some presentations from a few different speakers who've been doing a lot of the kind of cutting edge work in this space. So I think an exciting session, if that's something that's of interest to you. And then, I think the other sessions have some really great presentations in them too.
So Puri and I were both in Chicago the other day. He kind of lives there as he goes to University of Illinois, Chicago. But was anybody else at the Informs Logistics Conference 2 weeks ago in Chicago with us? So all this vendors decomposition stuff reminded me of it. So I was interacting with Jason, or let's see, who was that? Did we lose your co-author, Jason? So yes, Jason, I guess, and Yasin and I were interacting in the chat box a bit about vendors because it came up a lot.
It would.
Yeah. So, Jason, do you know where your name comes from?
I have some idea. I know
What?
Jason and the Argonauts.
Yeah, exactly. So we basically have the same name. So my name is Jason as well.
Yeah.
But it's written translation letter by letter, but the whole name translation is Jason. Yeah, can I share my screen to show you? Like,
Sure. Yeah, of course.
yeah, so go to the name. Like in Greek, this is the word. So this is why you see my name with I in the beginning.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, so some Greek words, like when they translate it to English, English words that come from Greek words, like and when the Greek word starts with I, like it becomes J.
Okay.
Such as July, for example, or the same thing. So
yeah, well, and both my children are named after not Greek, but so my daughter's name is Alexandria, which is for Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
Who, it's sort of Macedonian Greek, and then my son is named for Cyrus the Great. So named them after great conquerors.
Yeah. What is the name of your son?
Cyrus.
Oh, Cyrus.
Yeah, so he was a Persian emperor.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
So Priyanka has been helping us as our tech staff person today. Priyanka, reveal yourself. I bought her a camera so she could do this. Hope she set up. There's Aditi.
Yes.
Aditi is an undergraduate research assistant here in mechanical engineering, and Priyanka's been here as a graduate student researcher for several years now. So Kelly and Yuntak and Yujit and Shujia, Daniel, Biswarup and Untak, please feel free to share your video. We got to see Jiang Bo earlier. And I do highly recommend, maybe because I'm female, but we really would prefer to see a photo of you than a black and white name. I go into these meetings with men and they all don't share their screens, and it's like a lot of black and white. I'm just like, man, we women are not with you on that, I don't think.
I added a photo on my Zoom years ago because, well, I guess not that long ago, but when I was your postdoc.
Here I made him, yes. Yes, and I think I made
it.
Jason cut his hair too, poor thing. It's like he's my son. Yeah, Jason, if you could get my actual son to cut his hair, I would really appreciate it. Because I don't have any
I cut my hair before I went on vacation.
Oh, it looks great. Yeah. But it was getting long for a while. A lot of you had long COVID hair, right? Ali, what was your hair like during COVID? Ali, did you have a beard? Ali Mohammadi.
Yes.
I had a colleague with this white Gandalf beard. Like, I think he still has it. Like, man, if I were his wife at night, man, that would not last. That was weird. Don't tell him I said that. But yeah. And Puria, how are things in Chicago?
The weather is great. We actually in these days we experienced much hotter days the years before, but now it is not very hot. It is very good to go to the beach here, and also we are going to near fall very, very soon, and it is very actually the weather now is very nice.
Yeah, when I was on my vacation, so any of you who might be taking vacations at some point, like my conference sent me to Chicago and I made my family come, and then we drove all the way up to Quebec City, which I thought was supposed to be beautiful. It's not. It's not beautiful. But we did stop in Ann Arbor, so we got to see where a couple of you are doing your work, and we got to see the law school, which is very lovely there in Ann Arbor. And didn't have time for the museum. I bet I understand it's a good museum. And then we went to like Niagara Falls, which is so tacky. It is sickening.
Yes.
On the Canadian side. Oh my God, what happened? Of course, the falls are exciting, and you want to go when it's hot outside because you're going to get wet. But yeah. And then we went to Toronto and Montreal and finally Quebec City, which is cute, but I don't think they have any great museums. So the best part of the trip in terms of natural beauty was actually giving the car back to the United States, because it's very expensive to start your rental on this side and give it back on in another country. So we came back to Burlington, Vermont. And that was the most beautiful part of the trip. So in case any of you are planning to take your families from Chicago, like Puria, you might be doing this as your kids get a little older. Although, how old was that little boy we saw?
3.5-year-old.
Darling. Oh my gosh. Do you have one more?
No, this is just the only one.
Okay.
One and done.
Anybody else have kids? Jason has 2. Ali, how many do you have?
2.
Great. Abu Bakar, what do you have?
Just 1.
Okay, so the average is 1.5 right now or something like that. Anybody else? Although we have a lot of zeros. Okay, Chakma was at 0. So actually, I think the average is probably lower than 1 in this bunch of young people, young researchers. Kelly's on a call with a sponsor, so that's why she's not sharing her video. She's double duty. Any questions for me or Jason or any of the older people on this conversation or any?
Am I older now?
Well, you've been around the block.
How old are you, Jason? How old are you? I might be older than you.
33.
I'm also 33. Okay.
No, I'm older. 34.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm 54. Yes, and you don't have any kids yet?
No, not yet.
Do I sound like your mom? Just kidding. Having kids is hard, man. Toughest job you'll ever love. My husband hated kids, but thought we really needed to have some kids. And he still hates other people's kids, but oh my God, he'd do anything for our kids. And he does literally anything. They're pretty spoiled. It's weird. So for all you guys who are on the fence, some, especially the men who don't have a lot of babysitting experience, it can be really rewarding. Anybody have dogs or pets in their house?
No, but
oh my gosh, you are all focused. Maybe Kelly does, and she can't tell us. Aditi, do you have a dog back at your parents' house in Dallas?
I don't know. We don't have any.
Yeah, I think it's about time. So when my children started being mean to me, which was about age 14, they're twins, by the way, especially the girls. So this is a problem for women. They could be really mean to their moms. The females can't. So anyhow, we got a dog. Best decision ever. Yeah, but he's not big, right? He's 40 pounds. He's a mutt, and he's just the best thing. All of us agree. He's worth more than the house we live in. So
everyone in my family has a dog except me. So I've been seeing lots of dogs being back home in Victoria.
Oh yeah, you don't need a dog. You can go to the park and pet a dog, Jason. You are raising 2 little people right now. Your life is crazy.
Yeah.
Mine are going off to college, they're 19, so. Fatima, it's good to see you. Are you in, I forget, is it called Coors, or what's the name of the town in Connecticut where you have university?
It's Tours.
Oh, Tours.
It's Tours. S-T-O-R.
Oh, stores. Yeah, like you're going shopping, but without the E. Okay.
I sometimes say they hear it stores. It's stores.
No, I think that it's the same pronunciation for an American. We wouldn't be able to tell without seeing it. That's why everybody in the world should really learn and speak only Spanish. Let's forget all the other languages. They all pale in comparison to the awesomeness of Spanish. Children learn to read in like 2 months in Spanish. It's just so easy.
Yeah, I started learning Spanish a week ago. Just a few minutes a day, 10 minutes a day.
Y ahora ya pueden hablar conmigo. No hay problema, ¿no es cierto? Yeah, I started when I was like 13. But yeah. and it'll help you in Italy. But really, we should just abolish, just like the English system of units, just get rid of it. Let's all go metric and let's all go Spanish. So anybody have any professors in their family? Like my younger brother is a professor. Anybody have a family member, dad or something? Or
We have a lot. So
Fatima,
all my
Fatima's
siblings.
Iranian. She has a lot of educated people in her family. So tell us.
About professors, yeah, we are 5. I have 4 siblings. All of them are professors. Yes,
Wow.
yeah. So we have one who is a medical doctor and professor at the same time. I was thinking about that one. So my older brother.
Nobody else? Yeah. My parents were lucky to go to college, man. Especially my mom. Her mom didn't speak any English. Her dad died when she was 1. And she was on welfare. It was a long time ago. So luckily they pushed her into college. And my younger brother, but the older 3 siblings of mine, they didn't have the public schools that my younger brother and I had because we grew up in Palo Alto. And they had really good public schools. So anyhow, I'm sure you've learned more than you thought you would today about useless things. Aditi's mom is actually, I think, a professor in the medical school, I think at UT Dallas. Is that right, Aditi?
No, she's a physician, but she does some teaching at UT Southwestern.
Okay. Yeah. So that's pretty amazing. Okay. And many of you are professors or will soon be professors. So that's fantastic. So Jason, you want to show us the screen for the next one, or maybe Priyanka or Aditi want to show us the slide for the next set of papers?
Oh, I don't have those.
Oh, sorry.
I had for this one, but I think Aditi must be having for the next one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'll pull them up. Just give me a second.
So I will share a screen. Do you have Aditi? The slide?
Yes, I have them.
Okay, so sure.
So my students who are hosting the tech portion of these meetings here in the Western Hemisphere had to prepare these kind of at the last minute. So those of you who are sharing do not have them generally. Sorry about that.
Can everyone see that?
Mhm.
Yep.
I know Corey Harper, one of the first authors, was at Carnegie Mellon, and he may still be there. And Billy Riggs is a professor at the University of San Francisco. And then Priyanka, who you all know by now, and Fatima have been here. And Ken Perrine also works here at UT Austin. And Pratik Bansal used to be a student of mine. He now teaches at the National University of Singapore. And I don't know anybody else, but it sounds like Fatima is going to be doing the honors for those who stay in this room. So thank you for joining us. And Jason, thank you for chairing, even though I always jump in.
If it is possible, we can also get the photo with each group photo by screen sharing with each other.
Yeah, those who actually provided a photo. So I don't know, you want Aditi to remove the, or do you want to try to get the photo, Pooria, just doing a screenshot?
Yeah, sure. Just we can shut down the screen sharing, then I can.
Yeah, you can also just put that, yeah.
Yeah, okay. 1, 2, 3. Yes.
So
And I will send it to you, Cara. We can share it on our social
awesome,
media.
thank you. So this is UT's Longhorn, by the way, and I think Jingbu was doing peace, which is part of why we have Bridging Transportation Researchers to bring everybody together. It doesn't matter what politics are going on in the world, we are all one group of committed researchers.
Mm-hmm.
And human beings. So anyhow, I think I'm shifting to one of the other 3 sessions that are also going on, but you guys take care and email me if you have any questions.
Thank you, Cora.
Bye. Have a nice day, everybody.
Thanks, Jason, for moderating.
Yeah, no, of course.
So let's get started. Do we have all presenters here? Lily, not yet. So let's wait for 1 more minute and then start. Yeah, because we don't have our first presenter here yet.
Aditi, you may want to email the presenter, just
Please,
like,
yeah.
yeah, give a reminder.
Okay, I'll do that.
Email the link to the Zoom. Yeah.
Looks like you're missing the second presenter too, so might have to.
We cannot hear you, Jason.
Oh,
Okay.
it looks like you're missing your second presenter as well.
Okay.
Okay, so the second presenter said that he might have some connection difficulties, network difficulties, and he asked to play the video if he's not here.
Okay.
So we can start with that one and then go back to the first
Also
presenter.
video for the first presenter.
What's
So I
that?
can email from the first presenter, and I'm sending the link now.
Okay, great. Yeah.
And are you going to add co-host or sharing abilities to the presenters?
Yes, I'll add that now.
Okay, thank you.
And Aditi, can you please download the second presenter's presentation, William Riggs, and play for the second one?
Sure, I think I have it downloaded on my computer.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so let's get started. Welcome to the second track of second afternoon track of day 2 of Western sessions at the BTR conference. In this session, we will have 6 presentations about travel demand and transportation choices. Each presenter has about 15 to 18 minutes time to present and 2 minutes for a Q&A. In order to have an interactive session, please ask questions either in the chat box or raise your hand and ask your questions yourself. Our first presenter is Lily Hennig. Lily is a PhD student in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Her dissertation investigates the equity impacts of disruptions such as introduction of transportation network companies and electric vehicle integration. So Lily, the floor is yours. You can present.
Thanks so much. I'll share my screen and you. Great. Can everybody see the presentation? So my name is Lily Hennig. I am a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon, and I will be presenting on transportation network company ridership sensitivity to stay-at-home policies during COVID-19. And so transportation network companies such as Uber and Lyft are a relatively new technology in the past decade, and there is uncertainty whether they are a necessary service or whether they are a luxury good. So there's conflicting literature saying, so some studies showing that TNCs are primarily serving high-income riders, while other studies show that it actually complements public transit. And so we hypothesize that TNCs are potentially improving transit equity despite primarily serving high-income riders, because even if only a small number of riders are low income or transit dependent, they might be more dependent on TNCs, so less able to mode switch away from taking a transportation network company ride. And so we use Chicago's stay-at-home order in March of 2020 as a natural experiment to look at the dependence on TNCs by income. And during March 18th onward in 2020, for several weeks, people were told to shelter in place, except for essential trips like work, healthcare, and groceries. And people who could avoid taking a public mode, such as an Uber or the bus, chose to do so by, say, taking a private car or walking or just avoiding the trip altogether. And so the first question we ask is, what is the response in TNC ridership to the stay-at-home order by income, and is it heterogeneous? And so we assess the response to the stay-at-home order by income using a difference in difference style regression, and we run two models for robustness. The first, the interaction term, has income as a continuous variable, and the second has income as a binary, so more of a classic difference in difference style regression. And some assumptions we make, we assume that all the trips that happen during the stay-at-home order are both unavoidable and unsubstitutable. So if people are taking a TNC, they were making an essential trip that they could not have done in a different way. And we also assume that the parallel trends assumption holds. So if the pandemic and the stay-at-home order had not occurred, the ridership would have continued looking as it did previously. As in the income groups would have parallel ridership. And then we also assume that TNC passengers during the pandemic are a subset of non-pandemic TNC passengers and not a completely new set of riders. And then there is some data limitation, which we'll talk about in a second. So TNC data is provided by the city of Chicago, and we have the origin and destination of all TNC trips at the 15-minute window. At the census tract and community area level, we use community areas for our analysis, because if a trip was the only one to occur in that 15-minute window from that census tract, then that location is not included in the data set for privacy concerns of passengers. And due to this, there were a lot of location data thrown out at the census tract level during the stay-at-home order. And so we used community area where only 8.6% of the data location was excluded. And so this is what the community area map looks like in Chicago by income. And so methods, we took the TNC trip origins and combined that with demographic data at the community area level, as well as mobility data, to get trip counts per community area per day. And we modeled our regressions we tested our model fit on the first 20% of data using a few statistical models, and then ran the regressions on the remaining 80% of data And then for robustness, we also cluster the areas at the community area level. We checked parallel trends against the previous year, and we ran two different models, so income as continuous and as a split into high and low. And so just to go over the two models again in our difference in difference style regression, we are assessing the heterogeneous response to the stay-at-home order by income. And what we logged several of the continuous variables and then had an interaction term between income and stay-at-home order in the first model. And in the second model, we have an interaction term between income as a dummy variable and the stay-at-home order. And so what we see when we map, this is a map of income in blue at the community area level, and then trips before the stay-at-home order and in February, and trips after the stay-at-home order in April. And what we see is that before the stay-at-home order, high-income areas had really high ridership. But then after the stay-at-home order, the ridership decreased dramatically, and comparatively low-income areas did not have very high ridership before the pandemic, but that ridership during the stay-at-home order, so the purple circles, are about the same size. So that ridership was much more consistent throughout. So their ridership did not decrease to the same extent in those areas. And one exception to this is where O'Hare, the airport, is located. So even though it's a moderately low-income area, it had fairly high pre-pandemic ridership, and that's because it is an airport. And so a lot of those rides are not serving local community members, but actually just people coming from the airport. And so we excluded the 2 community areas that contained airports because they're outliers. And so for the second regression, if we, what we're showing here is TNC trips from February to May of 2020, and for both high and low income groups for both the raw data and the fitted model. And what we see here is that even though before the pandemic, TNC ridership was higher among high income areas than low income areas, it actually was lower after. So there was 56% more of a decrease in ridership than low income areas. And the trends are not seasonal. We compared 2020 in the bottom plot to 2019. And what you see in 2019 is that the ridership continued. So it's not that what we're seeing in 2020 is due to changes in weather or something. We also tested this assumption with an event study. So comparing each week to the week that the stay-at-home order went into place. And the coefficient is approximately 0 leading up to the stay-at-home order, and then it's significant after the stay-at-home order. So it's the 5th and 95th percentile intervals. And so there is significance to the coefficient found. And we also looked at how time of day patterns change during the stay-at-home order by income. And to do this, we matched trip origin and destination with demographic data and micromobility data to get trip origin destination pairs with information on the income of the area. And so what we expect is that because everybody who leaves their house every day presumably goes home eventually that day, in a given day, there should be as many high to low income trips as low to high income trips. And so if there's a difference there, it is signaling that people are taking a TNC only in one direction. And so, yeah, this is just if rates of low to high and high to low are uneven, then people are taking TNCs inconsistently. And what we find is that in February of 2020, before the pandemic, there was actually a significant 32% difference between low to high and high to low. So there are a lot more people taking TNCs from high to low income areas than low to high income areas throughout the day. And presumably this means that they are, say, taking something like the bus or walking to work or wherever they're going, and then taking a TNC at the end of the day. So this could signal a couple of things. It could signal that there's choice ridership, but it could also signal that there is uneven supply. So maybe people from low to high want to take an TNC, but they don't have the option to until their return trip or vice versa. And then what's interesting is that in April during the stay-at-home order, there's a lot more symmetry. So people, there's a lot less obvious choice ridership. So people taking TNCs only in one direction. And there's only an 8% difference between the low to high and high to low. And so the stay-at-home order reveals some dependence on TNCs that cannot be discerned in normal conditions. We use the stay-at-home order as a natural experiment to understand who is dependent on TNCs when only essential trips are encouraged. And we did this through an origin destination pair analysis to compare choice ridership. We also did this comparing across income groups in a difference in difference style regression, and found that ridership maintained more from low income areas than from high income areas during the stay-at-home order. And yeah, both formulations of the model showed that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lily. Is there any question for her? No? So we will go to our second presentation. Our second presentation will be by William Riggs. William is a program director and associate professor in the School of Management of University of San Francisco. He is a global
I think you're muted.
I still think you're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I said, so even the parts, is there any question from our previous presenter, Lily?
No, we heard that part. We heard
Okay.
the first part of the introduction to William Riggs.
It's weird that I got muted in the middle of my, when I was talking. So, okay, so I said that our second presenter is Billy Riggs. Billy Riggs is program director and associate professor in the School of Management at the University of San Francisco. He's a global expert and thought leader in the areas of autonomy and smart transportation, housing, economics, and urban development. Billy couldn't be here today, so he requested to play the recorded video of the presentation.
Riggs, and delighted to be here this morning. We've got a little bit of.
Can everyone hear the audio?
We cannot hear.
Yeah, it's very quiet.
Okay, I'll see if I can make it louder.
An exciting day today on August 10th, and that there is a hearing.
I think this is the loudest I can get it. I'm sorry.
My name is Billy Riggs, and delighted to be here this morning.
Yeah, we cannot hear anything. So
exciting day today.
I'm wondering if there is any feature in Zoom to play video directly. Are you using that, or you're sharing your screen?
I'm sharing my screen, and I'm also sharing the computer audio. And I have it set to 100%.
Jason, do you have any idea if there is any feature to play?
Yeah, maybe let's move on to the next presenter for now. Given that we record this, we can always kind of just embed this video in the recording video. But we can come back to the presentation at the end. I think it's an interesting presentation, so I think we'd all like to.
Yeah, I think it's
So
a better idea.
Let me have a look to see if I can find a way to make it louder.
Okay.
Yeah. So we will go to our third presentation. Our third presenter is Priyanka Paithankar. Priyanka is a second-year PhD student at UT Austin, working with Dr. Carl Kockelman. She has received her bachelor's degree in civil engineering from MIT Pune, India. and MTech degree in transportation engineering from IIT Bombay. After receiving her master's, she worked as a traffic engineer in a transportation consultancy firm. She began her doctoral studies at UT Austin in August 2021. In today's presentation, she will be talking about the international travel to and from the United States, especially using the airline data. Priyanka, can you share your screen and start your presentation?
Actually, Fatima, can we play the recording? Because I may have to reply to the coordinating session emails. Can we do that?
So I think we will have the same problem. Isn't it possible that you present?
Oh, okay.
It's okay, yeah.
Let me pull out the slides. Sorry, just a minute.
It's okay. I have your slides I can share, but I think it's better that you share it yourself so that you can go to the next slide.
Sorry, my PC is hanging. Just a minute. Yeah, it's taking time to load. I'm so sorry, I'm unable to start the presentation.
So I think it's
I feel
okay.
like my audio might be good in the recording.
So the thing is that we haven't figured out how to play the audio. So let's go to the fourth presentation. Sorry, everyone, for the problems here. So we will go to our fourth presentation. Our fourth presenter is Dr. Yu, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of California in Irvine. He's a professional transportation planner certified by Institute of Transportation Engineers. Dr. Yu provides solutions as a senior engineer through AECOM 2. Dr. Yu's research focuses on human AI teaming for resilient infrastructure and mobility systems. The floor is yours, Jiangbu. Please start your presentation.
Thanks. Let's see, how's my screen?
Yes, we can see your
good.
screen.
Hello, everyone. Today, I'd like to present a research on understanding consumer decisions and decision times when renting electric vehicles or EVs as taxis, which I think is an important topic in terms of promoting low carbon mobility as service systems. Choosing to rent between electric vehicles or EVs and internal combustion engine vehicles or ICEVs is a problem of multi-attribute decision under risk problem, especially considering EVs is a relatively new option in the taxi rental market. With the increasing availability of the deliberation, duration, or response time data, we wonder the utility of such data in helping us understand and predict people's preference. Currently, the dominant approach for capturing both decisions and response time, at least in the field of cognitive psychology over the past few decades, is called sequential sampling paradigm. One of the major theory or specification of this modeling approach is multi-attribute decision field theory, or MDFT, which has shown to be effective for capturing context effects in decision problems under certainty, and then risk effects for single attribute decision under risk. Unlike the existing multi-attribute cumulative prospect theory, or MCPT, MDFT captures not only the decisions, but also the response time distributions for each alternative, which provides a good platform for pursuing our research in understanding the utility of response time in understanding and predicting people's choice on renting electric vehicles as taxis. However, MDFT has not been used for capturing multi-attribute decision under risk, and therefore analyzing its effectiveness in multi-attribute in such a context, and in the application context is another contribution of our present research. We conducted our experiments in Singapore, where taxi service is an important component of the country's or the city's passenger transport systems. We conducted experiments in two main settings. We invited taxi drivers to participate through online survey, where we recorded people's choice and their response time. Here we refer to this data as quote-unquote web data. And then we also invited another group of taxi drivers to the lab in the National University of Singapore to answer similar questions, but this time we reported not only people's choice and response time, but also their eye movement. Here we refer to this set of data as the lab data. The survey initially determines the indifference lines or the trade-off lines among three major attributes: renting cost, or RC, or operating cost, OC, and driving range, DR. Then the survey branches into three major different components, which studies in details people's context effects, risk effects, and the framing effects. And then this presentation focuses on utilizing the second portion to understand the risk effects, especially the effects of risky operating cost or operating or OC, as taxi drivers usually perceive this particular attribute as the most risky and uncertain. Let's go further. MDFT can be intuitively understood using a hydraulic analogy, where we can treat the preference state P for each option as a water tank or reservoir, and then the valence V comes from the contrasting effect with different alternatives weighted by the tensions of each attribute. The valence here can be seen as the quote-unquote inflow of the preference state. Then we capture the decay rate D as the outflow, quote-unquote outflow, due to both the loss of working memory as well as the lateral inhibition in when people comparing among alternatives in their mind. Since when estimating the sequential sampling model, we not only care about preference but also response time, we adjusted the likelihood function of conventional random utility models so that the probability of correctly predicting a choice is penalized by the difference between the observed response time and the modeled response time. In this quote-unquote augmented likelihood function, the capital lambda here term captures the weight on the importance of capturing response time. With this exponential form of penalty term, we can obtain the corresponding log likelihood function, or quote-unquote augmented log likelihood function in a linear form, which can be further evaluated using a simulation. Now, surprisingly, the result shows that when we increase the importance of the response time, the accuracy of predicting preference decreases in the sample data, as the model not only need to capture preference, but also response time. However, we do notice that the model overfitting issue seems slightly alleviated, indicating that the response time can provide some useful information about predicting preference in cross-sample data. As we scale the attributes before estimation using the mean values of the attributes in the survey questions, corresponding decision weights beta here are relatively comparable, and we can see that in general, the operating cost is perhaps the most important attribute, and then is the driving range, and then is the renting cost. We can also find the accuracy from using, we've also find that accuracy using the lab data is not very satisfying, probably because the lab setting is very different than that of the web data. and the web data is more realistic in terms of the day-to-day compared to the day-to-day setting. Also, we try to use the eye tracking information as the proxy of the tension weights in the MDFT, and we find that the eye tracking data not only slightly improve the accuracy compared to using the lab data without eye tracking information, but still worse than the web data results. This is different finding than the existing literature. However, we do notice the existing literature using eye tracking data as a proxy for attention weights is only used for capturing context effects under certainty. So we suspect that the case where only one of the attributes is risky caused people to look at the risky attribute longer and more frequent, and therefore bias the estimate. It is also possible that risky information in general widen the difference between eye movement and the attention weights. We also compare the MDFT with MCPT, as MCPT or the cumulative prospect theory can only predict preference. So we only compare the case where lambda equals 0, so that the log likelihood function doesn't care about the response time. And we find that even both models have 7 unknown parameters, including a fixed error term to ensure the models are identifiable. We find that MDFT still outperforms MCPT. With an estimated model, we can pull out some instances. Here, in the first case where a person has a strong preference to ICEV over EV, in this case, we can see that average response time for both renting ICEVs and renting EVs are around 15 seconds or so. But if we lower the EV renting cost so that EV becomes more attractive, we see that the person now have a similar preference between ICEV and EV. And in this case, average response time increases for both options. We think it's reasonable as both utilities of the two options are similar, which implies that the decision now is slightly harder to make, assuming that, of course, the people actually think about the problem rather than just randomly pick one of the options. So we also conducted sensitivity analysis. For example, on the left side, we vary the probability of the preferable state of the operating cost, and we can see that people tend to choose EV more. On the right side, we varied the probability of the favorable state while keeping the expectation of the operating cost constant. We see that the effect of increasing the preference over EV is lessened. So in conclusion, we find that the sequential sampling approach, especially the specific MDFT model, provides an effective framework for predicting preference and response time in the context of the studying renting electric vehicles under risk and multi-attributes. We find that MDFT outperforms MCPT even we do not predict the response time data. The eye tracking weights are not a good approximator for attention weights, at least in the case where there is only one attribute being highly risky. We also find that response time can help mitigate the model overfitting issue. Lastly, we find that the operating costs play an important role when comparing with driving and renting costs. So the EV manufacturers and the renting agencies should focus more on this particular attribute to potentially increase EV adoption. And thank you for your attention. And please let us know if you have any question or anything you want to talk about. And thanks again.
Thank you, Jianbo, for your great presentation. We have one question in the chat box. Jason asked that Greg Allenby and colleagues developed a model specification with response time adjustment many years ago. Are you familiar with that work? And if so, how does your model compare to that one?
Oh, I'm personally not familiar with this. Maybe my co-authors are familiar with this. But thanks for your suggestion, Jason. I'll take a look at this.
Yeah, I think it was a 2008 paper. I at one point I was going to try to apply their method in a paper and then never got around to it. But it seems like kind of an early study looking at response time.
Yeah. Can I know what you mean by a response time adjustment? Is it like something like in the paper is controllable?
Yeah, they have kind of another term in their likelihood function for response time. I don't remember all the details of it.
Yeah, that's good to know. Yeah, thanks for the suggestion.
Yeah.
Any other question for Jianbo? I actually have a question. Can you explain a little bit more about how you use the eye tracking data and how you designed this experiments?
Well, the experiment design is mainly done by Pratik Bansal and Jesse in Singapore, and I'm the one mainly do the model and analysis and estimation. But I do know that I think they bought the equipment for like put on the head, and then they can track the eye movement in front of the computer, and so they can present people with different decisions or different attribute combinations of both EVs and ICEV, EVs and ICEVs, and then to let them choose, and then during the process they will track. They will know how many seconds or milliseconds each attribute or each text portion or look at. So we know how much time people look at certain specific attributes or information. So that's kind of how, yeah.
So your intention was to figure out how much they think about those information?
Yeah, we want to test whether, because in the existing literature, when the attributes are certain, people found that the eye movement, the attention, or how long people look at a specific attributes actually is a good approximator to the actual attention weights in the cognitive mathematical psychology models, which is a little bit similar to the discrete utility models where we have this weights on different attributes. Right? But the people find in cognitive psychology that the eye movement actually is a good approximator to that. And we find that when only one of the attributes being uncertain, the people put a lot of weight on, which makes sense. I mean, people put a lot of attention on that particular risky attributes, which bias the estimates a lot. So, but that's our finding. But I mean, back to the question. I mean, yeah, that's we just kind of tried to use the eye tracking information as approximation for the attention weights.
That's interesting. Yeah. So any other question from Jiangbu? No? Thank you so much for your great presentation, Jiangbu. We will go back to our third presenter, Priyanka Paitankar. Priyanka will talk about the international travel to and from the US. Priyanka, you can share your screen and start your presentation.
Hello, everyone. Let me just keep this here. My name is Priyanka, and I'm a second-year PhD student at UT Austin. I'm working with Dr. Kokelman, and today I'm going to present on Americans' international travel patterns, focusing on their destination preferences, airfare trains to and from US. So before I brief you about the objectives, let me give you a brief about the past international travels from US. So on an average, Americans have made 134.5 million international person trips, according to NHTS 2016, which constitutes to 0.035 international trips per month per person. That also says that we have international departure and arrival every 5 years. It also adds to 7.7 trillion passenger miles, out of which 4.5% were through international air. We had 254 million international air trips, out of which Americans had a share of almost 49%. In terms of revenue passenger miles, US airlines handling international travel had a 40% share in total. In the same year, we had 128 million international arrivals and 126 million international departures, out of which US airlines handled almost 47% in both of them. If we talk about the departures, 26% of international departures are to Canada, 23% to Mexico, and rest 50% are to overseas. About in case of international arrivals, 32% came from Canada and Mexico, out of which 22% are through land and 9.6% by air. And we did expected the reduction in this international travel due to COVID-19 pandemic, which reduced to 76% in 2020 as compared to 2019, and it quickly recovered in 2021, but then again increased by 141% in 2022. We see the similar reduction in international departures, which decreased to 74% in 2020 and 65% in 2021. So this was all about the international air trips. If we look at the international ground trips, we have 1 billion person trips crossing US, Canada, and US, Mexico borders, and both countries had 50-50% split. If we look at the modes of travel, 78% of those trips used private vehicle, 21% walked crossing the border, and rest 1% used train and buses. In case of vehicle distribution, we had 540 million ground vehicles crossing the borders, out of which 86% were personal vehicles, 14% were trucks, that was our freight trips, and the rest was using trains and buses. If you look at the travel spending, on an average, American spends $1,487 per person outside US, according to API's data 2019. The total travel spending in 2021 was $74 billion, which almost constitutes to $223 per capita, 30% of which happening in just 1 month, which is December. If we look at the international tourist spending, it's expected to reach 84% in 2026 as of 2019 levels after COVID-19 hit. So we can agree that although the coronavirus is going to mutate and we have rising oil prices, it's still the rising vaccination rates and loosened travel restriction will again raise the overseas journeys. We have seen the most of the past research. It either narrowly targets tourist destination trains and then separates airfare predictions. However, we can see that travel decision, flight cost, and destination choice are all linked to each other. So we need this all-encompassing method to understand this international choice behavior and then its subsequent effect on the destination choice. So this study, it combines making an international trip decision with the airfare fluctuation modeling and then its impact on choice of destination. So the most important data that we have used here is passenger airline data. It's called DB1B. It's 10% random sample of American airline passenger tickets, which are recorded by US airlines only. It has OD data, the time of the year when the trip was made, the quarter of the year, number of passenger who bought the ticket together, number of stops in an itinerary, distance flown, and the fare paid by the passenger. It has 13.6 million itineraries consisting 3.9 million passengers. We are also using NSGS 2017 dataset, which has information of 264,000 Americans making 134.5 million international trips. We also wanted to incorporate the characteristics of destination country. So we collected population and the major language spoken at the destination from UN website. We also collected tourist attraction in 2019. So this report basically covers 400 cities worldwide. A tourist is defined here as any person who is traveling to another country for at least 24 hours, residing paid or unpaid group or maybe in private lodging, but the period should not exceed 12 months. So the model framework starts with the trip frequency model. So we are using a zero inflated negative binomial model to find the number of long distance trips exceeding 75 miles. And the model was used by Fakhr Musavi in 2022. It gives the probability of a person making a long distance trip. And then if a person is making a trip, then what is the frequency of that trip over the year? after a person is decided to make a LD trip, whether the trip was international against the domestic, we are using a binomial logit model. We used a DB1B sample data to find to predict the flight fare based on trip attributes. So we are using feasible generalized least square models for that. This data lacked flight duration, so we had to assume an average speed of 500 miles per hour and average delay at stop, which is 3 hours. Then using these inputs, we distributed these trips with the help of origin constraint gravity model, and then simulated destination choice for each individual. So I will just go through the estimates of every model one by one. Finding the trip frequency, we used a zero inflated negative binomial model, which has two parts. First is zero inflation model, which will give the probability of making a trip, and the negative binomial model on top of it, which will give the trip frequency. And we can see that gender and the household income, education, and employment status are statistically significant. We can also see that if we increase, there is an increase in trip frequency by 51%. If we increase the household income by a standard deviation. We also see that if we shift the population towards the male population, the trip frequency increases by 21%. Also, the high educated people tend to have more international trips as compared to the other people in the population. To find the probability of making an international trip versus a domestic trip, we are using a binary logistic model, and we can see that race, gender, employment status, time of the year when the trip was taken, and the trip purpose were quite significant. The model also indicates the probability of an American making an international trip. It will increase by 16% if you increase the household income by a standard deviation. However, we also, if we shift the population towards a summer and spring trip indicator, then again the trip frequency increases by 19% and 14% respectively. But on the other hand, if we shift the population towards female indicator, then the trip falls by 31%, and we see similar decrease in trip frequency if a person is fully employed. To find the flight fare for round trips to and from US, we are using feasible generalized least square model. And we can see that flight fare decreases whenever we are adding an intermediate stop in an itinerary. If we increase the number of passenger, which is a party size of the itinerary, and if we choose unrestricted coach class as compared to a business or restricted coach class. Also, we found that if you are booking a restricted coach class, the flight fare rises by $0.058 per mile, whereas if you book with a business class, the rise is $0.281 per mile. Interestingly, the cost of air travel to country with higher population density is comparatively lower than the lower population density country, and this can be attributed to increased number of flights to densely populated countries. It leads to heightened competition among airlines and consequent reduction in airfare. The cost of return journey to English-speaking country nation is comparatively lower than non-English speaking destination. Again, the restricted coach class ticket was found more expensive than unrestricted one, and Hawaiian Airlines were found to be most expensive if we keep other parameters constant. We can also see that the cost of travel during months of October to December is comparatively higher than other months throughout the year, shifting these samples toward business class, and with United Airlines, it's going to increase the flight fare by 150% and almost 8% respectively. With the feasible generalized least square method, we also look at the variance of errors. So basically, a variance model presents the model estimates when the log linear model residuals is regressed on all the dependent variables. So if the coefficients show a significant deviation from 0, it implies that there is an existence of heteroscedasticity. If the coefficient is positive, it indicates the direct relationship between independent variable and the variance of errors, and it's vice versa if the coefficient is negative. And we can see that flight prices of itinerary with having more than one stop, traveling to non-English speaking destination, and having more than one party size, they vary significantly in prices as compared to others. Additionally, we also found that the destination characteristics such as population, languages spoken at the destination, and party size increases the variance of errors in the model. Similarly, we model one-way flight fares using feasible generalized least square method, and we can see that flight prices cost $0.078 per mile flown for a coach class and $0.163 per mile for business class and higher. Similar trend we can see in one-way flight fares also. The fare will decrease as the number of passenger increases and number of stops increases in an itinerary. If we look at the practical significance of these variables, we can see that if we shift the population towards the business class, it increases the flight fare by 125%. If we are choosing Southwest Airlines, the flight fare is gonna reduced by almost 60%. There is also a similar trend found in one-way flight fares. We see an air travel to country with higher population density cost less than the destination with a lower population density. Also, a return journey to an English-speaking nation is comparatively lower than a trip to a non-English-speaking destination. Similarly, the variance estimates shows that itineraries with more than one stop, if it is traveling to non-English speaking destinations, and with increasing party size, it increases the variance of errors. It was also interesting to note that a trip made from April to June shows the highest variation in errors as compared to other days of the year. So to distribute these trips among all the international destination, we have used origin constraint log linear gravity model, which will distribute trips from 334 US airports to 1,028 international airports. The friction factor consists of air travel times, auto and air travel times and cost. It has normalized by value of time. We have some assumptions here. The value of travel time for air travelers is $30 per hour, while for auto users is $20 per hour. And the model estimates shows that the trip location, the origin location, friction factor, population at the destination country, whether the destination falls in a tourist attraction or not, and whether the destination country is English speaking or not, were found to be quite significant. We can also see that trips heading to foreign destinations from an American airport falls by 41% if you increase the travel time and cost together by 7 hours. And also the frequency increases by 48% if the destination happens to be a tourist attraction. So in conclusion, we see that probability of making an international trip will rise by 16% if you increase a household income by on an average 62,000, which is a one standard deviation of the data. If the population is shifted towards male and white people, it increases the probability by 23% and 16%. if a trip is highly probably to summer and spring, the probability is going to increase by 19% and 14% respectively. Whereas the same probability will fall by 22% if you have a female, if a person happens to be a female, and it decreases by 31% if the person is full-time employed. We also see that round trip air tickets from October to December are more expensive than other months, and the one-way flight prices are much more variable in April to June. If we shift the sample towards business class or higher, the one-way flight fare will increase by 125%, while round-trip fares will increase by 151%. A trip to an English-speaking destination, it will fall by $0.008 per distance flown if it is a round trip, and if it is a one-way trip, it's going to fall by $0.01 per distance flown. Also, the prices falls if we increase the party size and the population of the destination country increases. We also saw that trips heading to foreign destination will increase from an American airport will fall by 41% if we increase the travel time by 7 hours, and it increases by 48% if the destination is a tourist attraction. Also, if you think about the probability of making an international trip, it's going to increase by 13% if the destination is a tourist attraction. Thank you so much for your time, and I will appreciate any questions and thoughts about this study.
Thank you, Priyanka, for your great presentation. We have one question in the chat box. Jason asked if the R squared, if the R squared that you presented in the long distance trip frequency model, is it R squared or pseudo R squared? I think he was mentioning that pseudo R squared make more sense.
Priyanka, the R squared for the zero inflated model, it's very small.
Yeah, so
I think everything that we presented was pseudo R squared.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah.
I mean, I'm not an author on it, but I did contribute to it. So I was just curious.
Yeah, thank you. Any other question from Priyanka? Please ask questions. Nothing? Priyanka, let me ask you a question. So what is the main application of this word?
It's so as we saw in the past studies, we have many studies who focused on flight fare prediction. We have studies finding a destination choice, on also whether the person will make an international trip or not. But we do agree to some extent that all of these three activities are somewhere interrelated. So I think this study will maybe give a start to have that integrated approach when we think about international travel.
Great. Thank you so much. So I think we can go to our next presenter. So please stop sharing. Mm-hmm. Our next presenter is Dr. Andre Carroll. He's an associate professor of transportation engineering at The Ohio State University and the director of OSU Travel Behavior Research Group. Dr. Carroll's area of expertise is travel demand forecasting, novel travel data collection techniques, and public transportation. Dr. Carroll, you already shared your screen. Please feel free to start your presentation.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. So, well, hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And so today I'll talk to you about transit asset management. I'm presenting a paper here that my student Yushen Wang and I recently published. This was work together with William Robert from Spy Pond Partners, LLC. I have the reference at the end of the presentation. So as a general introduction here, keeping transit assets, which includes vehicles, facilities, and guideways in a state of good repair, is really critical to maintaining and growing transit ridership so that transit can fulfill its role in the transition to a sustainable and equitable transportation system. Now, despite this importance, we have a growing backlog in state of good repair investments in the United States, and this results in deterioration of transit assets. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates that the current investment backlog nationwide is at $176 billion. And over a 10-year period that ended in 2017, the US DOT determined that over 36% of facilities, over 21% of systems, and over 18% of vehicles were in poor condition. So if assets are left to deteriorate without appropriate maintenance or replacement, this eventually leads to mode shifts away from transit. Now, the figure here shows this conceptually. So on the vertical axis, we have the system ridership. On the horizontal axis, we have time. And when vehicles and stations and facilities are new, we might expect an increasing trend in ridership. The system, on average, tends to attract new riders, as shown by this line here. Now, after a certain period of operation, we will hit an optimal maintenance point. That maintenance point is shown down here. And so if we don't invest in maintenance at this point, we won't have noticeable impacts immediately. However, as we let the assets further deteriorate, then vehicle breakdowns and system disruptions and unreliability increase, and the visual appeal and comfort and feeling of safety on a transit system decrease. So as we pass a conceptual threshold, which is shown here, this begins to affect ridership, and as people that become fed up with these problems and stop using the transit system. So here now we have a divergence between the theoretical ridership trend, if we had maintained the system in a state of good repair, and the observed ridership trend, which is the lower line here, that reflects the impact of the deteriorating assets. Now, many of these former riders will switch to less sustainable modes, for example, the car. So therefore, in addition to the revenue losses that this is going to cause for the transit agency, the observed ridership trend then also comes with societal and environmental impacts. Now, to justify state of good repair investments, agencies generally conduct economic efficiency evaluations such as cost-benefit analyses. The costs of state of good repair investments are often clear, but the question is, what are the benefits? Now, clearly, the main benefit would be to keep the ridership trend on this upper line rather than the lower line. However, it actually turns out that our ability to forecast this trend with current travel demand models is extremely limited. And there's practically no literature that helps estimate the ridership impacts of transit asset deterioration. So this is a big gap in the literature, and it makes it a lot more difficult for agencies to predict the benefits of state of good repair investments and to make a case to decision makers for investing in state of good repair. So as a result, agencies cannot make optimal asset management decisions, and decision makers keep prioritizing flashy new projects over maintenance and replacement. So in this research project, we asked ourselves how big this problem really is in quantitative terms. If ridership trends in the context of deferred maintenance cannot be predicted well, they will simply be guesstimated by agency staff and forecast with methods that don't appropriately capture the dynamics at play. So this leads to variance in the ridership forecasts, right? Everyone kind of has a different approach here. The approaches are not actually that accurate. And so as a result, then we end up with variance in the projected benefits of maintaining a state of good repair. So given this context, the objectives of this research were the following. So first, we wanted to quantify the variance of state of good repair, or SGR, benefits that can be attributed to the uncertainty surrounding forecasts of travel demand impacts. So in other words, if travel demand impacts of deteriorating system are unclear, what is the effect in terms of variance going to be on our benefits forecasts? And then second, we wanted to determine whether this variance is a function of the type of transit asset involved. So in the long run, one of our goals here is to draw attention to the real-world consequences of the lack of research on this subject and to help justify additional research funding to address the gap. So to explain our methodology, I'll have to step away from this for a moment and first introduce TCRP Report 206. So this report was published in 2019, and it provides guidance for agencies to calculate the costs and benefits of transit SGR programs. A part of this report is an Excel tool for agency use. It's called the ROI calculator, return on investment calculator. And this ROI calculator helps agencies quantify the costs and benefits of making SGR investments versus deferring them and not making the investments. So in this case, this is a little different than your typical transportation infrastructure investment that that we tend to learn about in transportation economics courses, because here the base case is actually to do nothing. So that's a deferred investment. We don't maintain the system. And the investment case is actually to invest in the maintenance and the replacement of system components and assets. Now, in this ROI calculator tool, the user inputs variables that include the projected changes in travel demand. So the user has to have some source for how the travel demand will change if they let the system deteriorate. And the ROI calculator then determines the costs and the monetized benefits of an SGR investment. So the benefits here, they also, generally they include the societal and agency costs that are avoided by maintaining the system and not letting it deteriorate. So the problem now, of course, as we discussed previously, is that projecting this travel demand, the travel demand impacts of letting assets deteriorate is extremely difficult, and results are generally very uncertain given the lack of research. So in this research project now, we used the ROI calculator and treated it as a black box model. And we conducted a sensitivity analysis. So we were interested in the sensitivity, the variance of the calculated benefits. What is the benefit to the agency and society of maintaining transit to the travel demand inputs? And we only consider the travel demand, we didn't only consider the travel demand variables themselves, but when we calculate benefits, a lot of the benefits are derived from variables that travel demand interacts with. So for example, car trips that are avoided, that results in emissions that are avoided, right? So we also we used the variables that travel demand interacts with to yield benefits. We conducted this sensitivity analysis with a global variance-based sensitivity analysis technique called the Sobel method. This method relies on Monte Carlo simulations where all the analysis variables are manipulated simultaneously. And this allows it to account for interaction effects between travel demand and other variables. So this diagram shows our methodology. The ROI calculator actually has a large set of inputs that analysts have to input. And we selected a subset of those variables for the sensitivity analysis. So this included the travel demand variables, as well as variables that interact with travel demand when it comes to yielding benefits. The other variables, all the others that had no interaction with travel demand, we kept those fixed at default values suggested by the authors of the report. And then we generated 36 state of good repair investment scenarios. So these were hypothetical, but realistic scenarios. And we based them on information and data from actual transit agencies. So these were our inputs. Now for each scenario of these 37 scenarios, we iterated through 10,000 Monte Carlo simulation runs where the variables selected for the analysis were varied, and the ROI calculator determined the costs and benefits of making the investment. So in our case, the only results we were interested in were the calculated benefits. The Sobel method decomposes the variance of the results into partial variances, and it attributes those partial variances to individual variables. It yields two measures for each variable. One is called the first order sensitivity, and the second is called the total order sensitivity. The first order sensitivity, it quantifies the share of total variance of all the benefits that can be attributed to one specific variable without considering the interaction effects. And then the total order sensitivity does the same, but it considers all the interaction effects. So here's I mentioned we selected a set of variables, travel demand plus variables interacts with. So here's that list of what we selected. The ROI calculator has two should I say, direct travel demand variables. One is the estimated reduction in transit demand if we do not make the state of good repair investment. And the second is the percent mode shift to auto. How many of those people who are lost as transit riders are going to start using the car? Then we have the interaction variables. So we have social and user costs. So these are local environmental costs, congestion costs, and operating costs of the automobile. And then some information, this is statistical information about how people use the car in this urban area where the transit system is located. So this includes the average occupancy, trip length, and trip duration by car. And then finally, we integrated we integrated one more variable that was actually not included in the original ROI calculator, which was the cost of greenhouse gas emissions. So interestingly, the guidance is what is de facto an official guidance now, more or less, for transit agencies, does not actually include the cost of climate change in the guidance to determine the benefits of investing in state of good repair for transit. So we decided to add that and include it. So, as I mentioned, we generated these 37 SGR investment scenarios for the analysis. The scenarios were hypothetical, but they were realistic. They were based on agency data, and they involved bus, light rail, and heavy rail systems. We selected 16 agencies from across the United States. These 16 agencies, in order to be included, they had to serve a region with more than 2 million residents. And we had to be able to access sufficient information on asset conditions and maintenance plans in order to actually generate our scenarios. As data sources, we use the National Transit Database, and we use public and internal agency documents, including agency budgets, statement of investment needs, and SGR reports where we could obtain them. So we generated scenarios for 4 types of state of good repair replacements, investments, excuse me. Bus replacements, rail vehicle replacements, general vehicle maintenance, and guideway rehabilitation. So guideway rehabilitation projects, we prioritize those when the data allowed. Otherwise, in order to determine which type of scenario to assign for a particular agency, we followed this flow chart, which considered data availability, the modes present, and the age of the vehicle fleet or of the rail system. So with this, let's move on to the results. First, we have two tables here that show high-level measures by type of scenario. So at the top, we see, now remember, we're talking about the benefits of state of good repair investments, and specifically, we're interested in the variability, right? Now, the problem is that the variability in absolute terms doesn't mean much to us because these SGR projects have a very large range of amount of investment. So if New York City Transit replaces half its bus fleet, that is a huge investment. If a smaller agency replaces a few rail vehicles, a much smaller investment. So at the top, we are expressing the standard deviation of the benefits as a fraction of the investment cost, as a percentage of the actual amount of the investment. At the bottom, we're looking at the standard deviation of the benefits divided by the average total benefits. So this is effectively the coefficient of variation of the benefits of our state of good repair investment. So as an example, what we see here, the standard deviation of the calculated benefits for vehicle maintenance scenarios and for bus replacement scenarios. So this is the variability, right, is actually almost as big as the investment itself. So about 96% on average. And below, we can see that when we consider the, for example, guideway rehabilitation projects, we see that approximately 27%, the standard deviation accounts for approximately 27% of the average total benefits that these projects would yield. So note how large these results are, right? Here they're sorted by the level of impact. So at the top, we see that the vehicle maintenance and bus replacement scenarios are followed by guideway rehabilitation and rail replacement scenarios. But below, we see that when we consider the coefficient of variation, then actually guideway rehabilitation scenarios are the most sensitive to erroneous forecasts in travel demand. So if we don't know what the impact is of our guideways deteriorating, we try to forecast that. The uncertainty of that forecast is actually going to have a major impact here, and our guideway rehabilitation scenario, when we conduct the economic efficiency analysis, is going to be relatively sensitive to that. And we see the differences between scenario types down here as well, right? guideway rehabilitation, rail replacement, bus replacement, vehicle maintenance at the bottom in terms of the coefficient of variation. So these are very large results. And this indicates that the uncertainty in travel demand outcomes has potentially large effects on economic efficiency measures, such as the cost-benefit ratio. And the impacts here actually in absolute terms can be on the order of several $100 million. So in the top table, the order is, of course, related to the fact that general vehicle maintenance scenarios and bus replacement investments tend to involve less capital expenditure than guideway rehabilitation and rail replacement investments. So here, the investment cost is the denominator, and therefore, these drop a little farther down. So at the bottom, however, as I said, we see that the guideway rehabilitation projects are particularly vulnerable to erroneous projections of ridership trends. So now we consider the contribution of individual variables. And we want to know what has the most impact here. So if we can invest in improving something about these inputs, what should we invest in? And this is based on the first order sensitivity and the total order sensitivity calculated in a Sobel method. And what we found was the two travel demand variables. So this is what would come from a travel demand model. These consistently showed up as the top contributors to the variability of the SGR benefits in our analysis. So in other words, by investing in research and developing better travel demand forecasting methods to predict SGR-related ridership trends, the demand-related variance of the projected benefits could be reduced by 20 to 49%. This is really significant. And since we're talking about societal impacts, the variable that quantified how many former transit riders migrated to the car was actually more important than the amount of ridership decrease itself. On the other hand, the variables that quantified social and user costs, so this is what we might derive from life cycle analyses, for example, had comparatively low impacts on the demand-related variance of projected benefits. So research to better quantify these variables, including local environmental costs, but including greenhouse gas emissions, would have little influence on improving the estimation of SGR benefits. Well, now if people migrate from transit to the car, then the negative impacts depend on how they will use the car. So the variables such as the statistical variables, such as average car occupancy, trip length, and trip duration by car, they had a medium level impact. The demand-related variance of calculated benefits could be reduced by 10 to 15% simply by going out and collecting better statistics on car use in the metropolitan area where the transit agency is located, even without fixing the travel demand models. And then finally, we considered the valuation of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, we found that this variable is actually quite impactful, and better quantification of the effects of climate change could lead to a 10 to 31% reduction in the demand-related variance of SGR benefit calculations. Now, that is if climate change is included at all, of course, which, as I said, it is actually not in the ROI calculator in the TCRP guidance. Now, the effect of the valuation of greenhouse gas emissions, it was highest for vehicle replacement scenarios, which kind of makes sense, right? You're upgrading to new engines and more efficient vehicles. And it was lowest for guideway rehabilitation scenarios. Now, of course, here we have a problem that differs a little bit from the other situations because many effects of climate change will remain uncertain, and we'll need to find ways to reflect and communicate the respective variance rather than to try and reduce it, or at least reduce as much as we can, but we will have to live with some uncertainty. So to wrap up, let's look at the key outcomes of this research. We've quantified the impacts of a gap in the travel demand literature on the real-world transportation investment evaluations. And we found that our lack of knowledge about how travel demand develops in deteriorating transit systems can majorly impact planners and engineers' ability to assess state of good repair investments and to make a good case for state of good repair to decision makers. And the demand-related variance, that will affect economic efficiency measures such as the benefit cost ratio and net present value, and thereby really increases the risk of suboptimal infrastructure and asset management decisions. Now, there's also a better need to communicate and present the uncertainty that is inherent in many benefit forecasts due to constraints on our ability to predict travel demand. Overall, though, we conclude that there is an urgent need for more research on the relationship between travel demand and state of good repair and transit systems. And a new integrated framework for agencies that links asset deterioration models to travel demand models would have a huge positive impact on the quality of investment decisions that agencies can make. All right, that's all I have for you today. So thank you very much. In case you're interested, this is the reference to the paper, and let's open the floor to questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for the great presentation and great work. We have 2 questions in the chat box. The first question, Lily asked what you considered for the cost of GHG emissions. Is it social cost?
Yes. Now, on the specific details, I'm a little fuzzy right now on the exact reference. We based ourselves on a so this was a sensitivity analysis that we were conducting, and so therefore for all of these input variables, let me go back here. I didn't talk about this in the interest of time, but effectively what we needed to do for each of these variables is we had to come up with a plausible range that this variable could take between a minimum and maximum value. And for lack of any better information, we just assumed that each of these variables as an input could be distributed uniformly. And so in the case of the social cost of carbon, so what we did here is we based ourselves on a paper that had just been published very recently when we performed the research. So this would be 2020 into 2021 in Nature, which I think it was Nature, which laid out like a range of possible scenarios and came up with a range of possible costs per ton of CO2 emissions. If you're interested, I could find that for you. But effectively, yes, we had a fairly large range of the cost of greenhouse gas emissions. I don't recall the lower bound. I know that the upper bound was, I think, even about $800.
Wow.
That is fairly large, I know.
Yes, yeah. So our second question was from Jason Soria. He asked, what case studies or study designs do you imagine informing the changes in the travel demand as a result of leaving the system in disrepair? And he said that how the age of bus and rail can affect the demand because it's an indicator of attractiveness of that vehicle.
This is a great question. So there are multiple sub-questions in here. Now, first of all, of course, I would love to actually see some sort of empirical research that really just follows ridership trends in sort of like I'm imagining like a comparative study between urban areas, one that invested more in its transit infrastructure than other, where we would actually have observed time series of decreasing ridership trends over time as the system goes into disrepair. Now, I said I wish we had that because that is very difficult to collect. Obviously, these are very long timeframes that we're looking at. So alternatively, what I think would be the way to go, and which would be potentially much more impactful, is actually a 3-step modeling framework. Let me go back down to my last page here. Okay, so here I only spoke about linking asset deterioration to travel demand, but there's actually an intermediate step here, right? So effectively, and I'm focusing just on the operational aspect here. If we let the assets deteriorate, the major impact is going to be increasing unreliability. And so the unreliability then, that is what's going to impact the travelers and ultimately cause them to leave the system. And so if we can establish those two links separately, I think we actually would already have we could create a very good workable framework in order to ultimately link asset deterioration to travel demand. So asset deterioration to level of service and reliability, and then level of service and reliability to travel demand. And the nice thing about that is those are things that can also be studied in the absence of a deteriorating system, or at least the travel demand part, right? Because we can conduct research on the impact of various types of unreliability, various negative experiences that travelers have on their loyalty and decision to remain transit riders. Now, as far as the second aspect, the second dimension of this goes, which is the traveler experience. So the visual attractiveness of the vehicle, the feeling of safety, that is a little harder. But I would also envision that as, I mean, effectively, that's also something that can be done in individual studies that don't necessarily have to be linked to asset deterioration, but that can look at, you know, various transit systems or routes and various degrees of disrepair or repair across the nation, with subjective studies. I mean, that would be, I think those would be survey-based studies, to try and understand at the quantitative level how the person's perception experience on board links to their willingness to remain a transit rider. Now, on a final note, and I'll stop, I'll say here from my own research, I have found that the operational aspects of travel time and reliability tend to have a much larger impact on people's long-term willingness to remain transit riders than these, I'll call them soft factors, such as the pleasantness of the environment, the comfort of the vehicles, etc.
Thank you so much for your detailed response. That was a great work. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to present it.
So our final presenter will be Jason Soria. Jason is a postdoctoral fellow at the Georgia Institute of Technology. His current research focuses on travel behavior changes after pandemic, which is the focus of this presentation that he will be presenting right now. In general, his research interests are investigating pressing behavioral trends in transportation and the interactions between humans, emerging transport services, traditional modes, and the built environment. Jason, feel free to share your screen and start your presentation.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for answering my questions, Dr. Corral. I hope I said that correctly. So I don't necessarily have a COVID aspect to my presentation, but hopefully after going through it, perhaps it might give the people in the audience some ideas about using some of the softer factors that Professor Corral mentioned earlier within their own research. So without further ado, let me share my screen and we can get started. All right, so I see that I'm sharing my screen and I'll just go ahead and start unless there's any objections. Again, I'm Jason Soria. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Georgia Institute of Technology. And this presentation today will be about marker variables, how to select them, and internal evaluation. Here are my goals for the presentation. First, I'll go over the marker variable concepts and the motivation behind using them. In short, marker variables are important variables used to impute values when the other variables are unavailable. And in the context of this study, this presentation, I'm looking at a subset of attitudinal items which were used in an exploratory factor analysis. Second, I'd like to identify where this study exists within this particular line of marker variable research. Third, I want to go through the heart of the study, the marker variable selection strategies and the results that we saw. We use what is called internal evaluation. This is using Pearson's correlation to measure the imputation accuracy between the imputed attitudes and the observed attitudes or factor scores. And after that, I can talk a little bit about my current work with marker variables and those findings. So here is a figure showing the concepts behind marker variables. It's adapted from Atiya Shah's doctoral dissertation, specifically figure 4.1, and I think she's present now, so please, if I do say something wrong, correct me, but this is how I interpreted your figure, where suppose we have two data sets, a donor data set here and a recipient data set. And there are some variables that are in common between these data sets. And those variables that are in common are denoted with a superscript C. Now, in the donor data set, there are some variables that are unique to it. Those have the variable superscript of U for unique. In travel behavior data, these X's can be our socioeconomic and built environment variables. And these Y's can be our attitudinal statements or items. Suppose now that we do an exploratory factor analysis using all of the attitudinal statements or items available in the donor data set. And with that factor analysis, we can calculate Bartlett factor scores. And I'm going to call those factor scores O. O for observed factor scores. Suppose now that within this recipient data set, we wish to know what those factor scores would have been, except we don't have all of the attitudinal statements needed to calculate that. So we can't get O here for the recipient data set. But what we can do is develop a transfer process, tau, where we use the observed factor scores from the donor data set as the target for a learning function f sub d trained on the variables that are in common from the donor data set. So this is XCD and YCD. We apply that learning function to the data from the recipient data set. So this is XCR and YCR. These variables that we're using, these variables that are in common between the data sets are our marker variables. And using those marker variables in the learning function f sub d, we can then calculate a prediction of what those factors could have been. So I'm going to call that O hat. And when we combine those imputed factor scores back to the recipient data set, what we end up with is an enriched data set where we might not have been able to get OR here, but we have a good estimate of what it can be. So the motivation behind this marker variable research is that if we have an existing data set and we have something, an outcome that we want to see that we've observed using it, we can apply some of that knowledge to a recipient data set, which might not have all of the data available that was originally used in the donor data set. There are fewer data requirements. So this particular line of marker variable research, there are two important works that I will cite here. Malokan et al. Use marker variables to impute several attitudes in transportation. And he used them in the National Household Travel Survey. And what that group found was that the imputed variables inserted into a vehicle ownership model accounted for a 1 to 5% improvement in model fit. And in Shaw's dissertation, this author did a few child behavior models and used imputed factor scores there and saw as high as a 0.09 increase in adjusted R squared from around 0.05, which is a remarkable increase when these imputed attitudes were included in a public transit usage model. So where does this study exist in this line of research? Well, we have internal evaluation where we're measuring our accuracy of attitude imputation. We have external evaluation where we're trying to measure the improvements in model fit for travel behavior models. And lastly, there's application. How can we apply these marker variable concepts in the development of new surveys? So Malokan et al. And Shaw did both internal evaluation and external evaluation. They measured how well they were imputing attitudes, as well as seeing the improvements that they had when included in travel behavior models. I decided to take a step back, and the novelty from this study is using only attitudinal items, but also exploring the methods of choosing which marker variables to select and the effects of the training data size. So the transfer process tau for me still uses the observed factor scores, but my learning function is only using attitudinal items, and I'm playing with the size of the training data set. So like I said earlier, we are the initial steps. There are still a lot of things that we want to consider. For example, are factors, attitudes stable across geographic areas, and are they stable through time? We want to answer these questions before applying these marker variable concepts to new surveys, but I hope that within this study, we're stepping in the right direction. So now on to the heart of this study. What I show on this slide are the statements coming from the exploratory factor analysis, specifically the ones that are used later in this presentation. I want to note that this is not the full exploratory factor analysis solution. This table only includes the statements that we will be referring to later on. But importantly, there were 6 factors that were extracted from this factor analysis: pro non-automobile alternatives, pro car owning, weighting and commute tolerance, materialism, tech savviness, and polychronicity. And the method that we use in this particular study to impute attitude scores is called elastic net regression. And in the interest of time, I won't describe every little thing about it, but I will say that it can be described with these 2 equations shown, and that each time we try to impute a factor, it had its own elastic net regression. And the reason why we used it is because it's a regularization technique that penalizes coefficients that do not contribute to the model. And it's a mix of lasso and ridge regression for those who are familiar with those methods. So now into the selection methods. And there is one thing that I want to point out because it's consistent in each of these methods. And these rules, where first we want to choose an initial set of marker variables with items that have the highest magnitude of pattern loadings. Each factor must be represented and select them in order from greatest to smallest in magnitude. So I have here, going from left to right, the marker variable order. We start off with 1, and factor 5 is the first one that's represented with statement G. That's our marker variable. And it had a pattern loading of minus 0.88 in the EFA with a communality of 0.79. Going down this list, we see factor 6 with statement AG, a pattern loading of 0.88 and a communality of 0.80, all the way down to factor 1 being represented with statement C, pattern loading 0.62 and communality of 0.48. So each of the methods described in the coming slides uses these first 6 marker variables, and we're adding marker variables one by one to see how much improvements we can get from including more marker variables. So in the next set of 6 marker variables, another rule that we have here is that factors, again, must be represented at least once. And to get an idea of what the lower bound of what we're working with is here, I have this table showing the correlations between imputed and observed factor scores when there are around 500 observations in the training data set. And the pattern to notice here is that pattern statements and factors with pattern loadings that are higher tend to have higher correlations already. So 0.88 here, 0.94 in correlation, 0.88 pattern loading, 0.93 in correlation. And at the end of the table with factor 1, statement C, pattern loading 0.62, we see a good dip in correlation to 0.72 compared to the marker variables starting up here. So here are the methods that we tested. First, choose the items or statements that load onto several factors. This is the 2 birds, 1 stone method. The next one is choose items with the highest communalities. In the exploratory factor analysis, communalities are the sum of squared pattern loadings. And so we hypothesized that because they have high communalities, that even though we might not have used the particular statement to describe a factor, it might have some loading on it that might inform it later when we include them in the marker variable list. And lastly, we have reversed the order of the initial marker variable factors that we saw on the previous table. And this is to support the factors with the lowest correlation. On the previous slide, that table showed that at the end of the table, the marker variables that had the lowest pattern loading had the lowest correlation between imputed and observed factor scores. For those who play fantasy sports, you can think of this of like a snake draft. So here are some of those results. Starting with strategy 1, choose items that load onto several factors. So what I want to focus on here is marker variables 7 and 8, where marker variable 7 represents both factor 1 and factor 2 with statement J, and the pattern loadings on those factors, 0.41 for factor 1 and minus 0.49 for factor 2. For marker variable 8, factor 2 makes another appearance, along with now factor 4. These are the pattern loadings of statement AA onto these factors. And what we can see here on these figures, the vertical axis is the correlation between imputed and observed factor scores. On this axis, the marker variables used in the elastic net regression, we are adding them in one by one. And the number of observations that we use in our training data set, this is in our learning function. So starting with factor 1 here, we see that when we go from factor 6 to 7, that we see a substantial increase in the correlation between the, again, imputed and observed factor scores. With factor 2, the one that I really want to focus on, we see that it's represented twice, going from 6 to 7, and then again from 7 to 8. And again, on this graph, we see that happening there as well, where going from the 6th to the 7th marker variable, and then from the 7th to the 8th marker variable, there are also substantial increases. So this is that two birds, one stone idea, where not only are we going to get two factors represented with one marker variable, but if we extend that a little bit further, we can get 3 with 2. And factor 4 here, I've included to show that even though these show substantial increases here and some minor increases here, that's not necessarily true for all of the factors that we're trying to impute. Going from 6 to 7 here, it remains fairly flat. And from 7 to 8, we see that increase because it is represented in that 8th marker variable. And then again, there's a substantial increase going from 11 to 12 because the 12th marker variable represents factor 4. So here are the results for our second selection method, choosing items with the highest communalities. And what I want to focus on here is at the end of this table, if we only wanted to include 9 marker variables, we are losing out on substantial increases for factors at the end of this set. And we can see that in these figures here, where I'm starting with factor 2. This is marker variable number 10. If we didn't explicitly represent factor 2 earlier, there aren't very high increases in correlation up until we get to that 10th marker variable. And that's what this jump is here. We see that again with factor 1. And then factor 4, even more so. And lastly, our third marker variable selection method, where we reverse the order of the first 6 factors. And then within those factors, we choose the statements with the second highest pattern loadings. And we wanted to do this to support the low correlations seen in that first 6 marker variables. So if we started with factor 5, then 6, 4, 3, 2, 1, now we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 5. And what we see happening here is that we have even more significant jumps in the correlation between imputed and observed factor scores. So if we go from factor 1 and then represent it again with a 7th marker variable, we quickly see the jumps here. So we went from 0.72 of a correlation to 0.82 about by making sure that we include it as the next marker variable. Same thing with factor 2. we see another substantial increase from 0.74 up to around 0.82 again. And then with factor 3, the same thing, large increases, this one from 0.74 to around 0.86. So here are the highlights of the results. First, something I didn't necessarily mention throughout those slides was that a very large sample size wasn't necessarily needed to train our learning function. Using this graph shown at the bottom of the slide to represent the other graphs that we saw earlier, as we moved along the axis for observations in our marker variable training data set, the shape of the graph doesn't necessarily change as much. In fact, in this case, we see that having 100 observations in the training data set performed around 0.86 for the marker variables, having 12 of them. And it only jumped up a little bit once we added a couple hundred more and really tapered off once we got beyond 300, 400 and beyond. And one highlight that I wanted to bring back from the beginning of this explanation was that items with the highest pattern loadings had the highest correlations between imputed factor scores and the observed factor scores. So that really leads into why I think the next few selection strategies are good strategies. Choosing items that appear in multiple factors in the second round of marker variables, again, that's strategy 1, is a good strategy because a single item can significantly improve the correlations of 2 factors. So here's a table recapping some of those results, where we see factor 2 being represented twice, while still also including 2 other factors. And factor 2 sees 2 substantial increases in correlation. And another desirable strategy is to support items with low pattern loadings. That's strategy 3. So in general, I think a good combination is strategy 1 and 3, because we want to support the things that we aren't necessarily predicting well. So make those a priority first once we've dealt with representing the other factors that we want to impute. And that's sort of implicitly what happened here. Factor 2 and factor 1 were at the end of that first initial set of marker variables, and then they were again represented here. So we see that sort of happening here. Now on to some of my current research, which focuses on external evaluation, where I'm looking at the limits of marker variables, specifically how few can be used in child behavior models when we're using them as marker variables to impute those factor scores. So what I did is estimate a vehicle ownership model using multinomial logit. And in this table, we're showing what happens when we add attitudes which were imputed from only a set of 4 marker variables. And this is called external evaluation because we're trying to see how well the model performs once we've added them into it. So our base model is a vehicle ownership model with no attitudes. And this is the success index of the vehicle ownership equals 0 category, where we start off with a success index of around 6. And a success index, in short, a higher value is a better value. We're predicting the 0 household vehicle ownership better. So once we start adding imputed attitudes into the model, such as this one here, MNL with standardized marker variables, that we didn't even really need to use a learning function. We simply assign numerical values, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the responses to a attitudinal statement, standardized that and included that in the model, we do see a substantial increase in the success index. Again, a higher number is better. And we also looked at a non-parametric method to impute those factor scores, again, with only those 4 marker variables, and saw a similar trend. And to see what the upper bound should have been, we did include an MNL model with observed attitudes. And we saw that the model with attitudes, even imputed, do very well and even approach the quality of what can be seen with the fully observed attitudes as if they came straight from the EFA. So that concludes my presentation. I've included the citations in their order of appearance. I originally had a few more, but I realized when I was practicing this presentation that I would have ran out of time, but these are the two ones that really inspired me. And I'd like to end by acknowledging who was funding this research. It was funded by TomNet, Teaching Old Models New Tricks, a university transportation center supported by the US DOT. And I'd like to especially thank my postdoc advisor, Professor Pat Mokhtarian at the Georgia Institute of Technology, who has really been an active partner in this research. And you will have likely seen her talk a lot about marker variable research in past presentations. I'd also like to thank Junyi Wong, Il-Soo Kim, and Seung-Eun Choi for providing very helpful comments that really did inform the direction of this research. And if you'd like to contact me, I've left my contact information below. And thank you for listening. I realize this is the end of the session, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much for the great presentation, Jason. I think we have one comment or question that we just received. Elisa said that great presentation, a very cool method. I may have missed this, but is there a minimum number of statements needed per factor? Are some factors represented by a single item or statement?
Yeah, let me go back into this. So with the EFA solution shown here, or at least the partial one of it, what we do show for specifically factor 5 and factor 6 are factors that only had 2 items attached to it. I do believe that life satisfaction is considered one of the very few single item factors that can be used within a factor analysis. So I think that might be an exception to the rule, but what I'm imagining here is that the marker variables, specifically for attitudinal statements, are coming from a factor solution where there are several attitudes informing that factor. For example, let's look at factor 1, pro non-automobile alternatives. The one starting here is I like the idea of public transit as a means of travel for me. I like the ideas of walking. I'm fine with not owning a car. I imagine that there's another one under here about using bikes. So I don't think that there's necessarily a minimum that is required for this specific marker variable research as much as the minimum is imposed by the standard that we use for factor analysis, where we say we typically want around 3 statements per factor that it's supposed to load onto significantly. And I still think that number is 0.3. But certainly, if you do want to use factors that have 2 statements on them, which is factor 5 and factor 6, I think that's totally fine. And especially if those pattern loadings are very high, you're already starting off with a high correlation with that single marker variable. So even if it only has 2, even just choosing one of them might be fine. And I think that's what makes this research sort of low-key very important, because if we're talking about reducing the number of attitudinal statements that we might want to use when we're developing a new survey, instead of going with that 40-item list that we're throwing out there and hoping that the respondent doesn't get bored, what if we only asked 10 and we had an existing EFA solution where we had all of those 40 statements informing a factor analysis and then imputed those factor scores with a new data set? And we already see that outside of transportation. Ramstead, I think, is the name of the researcher who looked more into this, specifically with the big 5 personalities, where the original big 5 item list was around 44 statements. And then they reduced that to around 10 and found that they still had very valid factor scores. So a minimum, not because I'm saying that there's a minimum, I'm saying there's a minimum only because that I think the research community expects that our factor analyses have multiple statements loading onto them. I hope that answers your question, Professor Borowski.
That was a great answer, yeah. Thank you so much. Is there any other question from Jason? That was a great presentation and great work. Thank you so much, Jason. And I think with this, we will wrap up this session. The quality of audio for our second presentation was not good, so we won't play that. Thank you so much, everyone, for presenting in this session. And thank you. I would like to thank others who attended this presentation. And I would like to thank all the organizers of the conference, especially Jason, Dr. Hawkins. So nice to meet you all, and hope to see you all next year.